They called him the Shadow of Milan, and she was the only thing he couldn't control. A 52-year-old man, blood still wet on his hands. A 24-year-old girl who had just buried the only man who had ever truly loved her. Amidst a mansion overflowing with corpses concealed by expensive suits, fate brought them together. This isn't a romance. This is the story of a man who has killed too many to know how to love, and the only young woman crazy enough to believe he can still be saved. Watch until the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The rain came down hard that night, the kind of rain that doesn't tap politely against windows but hammers them like it has a grudge. It had been raining for 3 days straight over Milan, the kind of unrelenting downpour that made the old city feel like something drowning slowly and refusing to admit it. Seraphina De Luca stood in front of the mirror in the second-floor bedroom she had slept in until she was 17. The same bedroom where she'd pressed her ear against the wall as a child, listening to her grandfather's voice rise and fall in argument with men she was never allowed to meet. The dress she'd chosen was black silk, fitted and cold against her skin. She hadn't cried yet. Not once since she'd gotten the call in New York 4 days ago, not on the 11-hour flight, not when she'd walked through customs and seen her mother's driver waiting with that flat, professional expression that communicated everything without saying a word. She hadn't cried because crying felt like giving something away, and she was already giving enough tonight just by being here. She pressed 2 fingers against the window pane and watched rain trace down the glass in crooked lines. Below her, black cars filled the circular driveway of the Moretti estate. Men in expensive suits moved between them with umbrellas they carried like weapons. She recognized some of them. Politicians she'd seen on television. A senator who had once patted her head when she was 9. 2 men from the southern coast, whose names she'd learned to forget before she was old enough to understand why forgetting them was necessary. Her grandfather, Eduardo Moretti, had been many things to many people. To the newspapers, he was a real estate magnate who had rebuilt 3 neighborhoods in Milan and funded a children's hospital in Tuscany. To the city's underground chain, which was not really underground at all, but threaded through every legitimate institution like rot through old wood, he had been something else entirely. A man of equilibrium, a man who kept the different families from tearing each other apart simply by being old enough and feared enough that no one wanted to test him. To Seraphina, he had been the only adult in her childhood who had ever asked what she wanted without immediately explaining why she couldn't have it. She was 24 years old. She'd spent 3 years at Columbia before medical school, and she'd been very deliberate about building a life that existed entirely on the other side of the ocean from this house. She was good at it, too. She was good at a lot of things she'd had to become good at fast. She pulled on a second earring, checked herself once in the mirror, and went downstairs. The funeral hall had been the estate's ballroom in another era, and someone had done a thorough job of transforming it. White lilies everywhere, because lilies were what Celeste De Luca had ordered, and nobody argued with what Celeste De Luca ordered. The lighting was low and respectful. A string quartet played something muted and European in the corner. The casket was mahogany, closed. Her grandfather had been very specific about that, apparently, and positioned beneath the hall's largest window, where the stained glass threw dim-colored light across the polished wood even in the dark. Seraphina moved through the room slowly. She accepted condolences from people whose names she half remembered. She shook hands. She said the right things. She kept her face arranged in the precise expression of composed grief that this room, these people, this world expected from a De Luca woman, because she'd grown up watching her mother perform it, and the muscle memory ran deep even when she hated it. She was halfway to the bar. She needed a drink, just one, just something to hold in her hands. When she saw him, Roman Valenti was standing near the far wall, speaking quietly with 2 men she didn't recognize. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that on anyone else might have read as careless, but on him read as deliberate. He was 52 years old, and he looked every year of it, not in a diminished way, but in the way of something that had been subjected to pressure for so long it had become dense. His hair was mostly silver. There was a scar that started just below his left ear and disappeared beneath his collar, a thin, pale line that she'd noticed for the first time when she was 15 and had spent the better part of a year trying not to look at. He hadn't seen her yet. She had known Roman Valenti since she was 12 years old, when he first started appearing at Eduardo's dinner table on Tuesday evenings. She disliked him initially. He was too quiet, too watchful. He looked at things like he was calculating them rather than experiencing them. By the time she was 16, she'd revised that assessment into something more complicated that she preferred not to examine. By the time she left for New York at 20, she'd spent 3 years working very hard at not thinking about him at all. She did not walk toward him. She turned and went to the bar and got a glass of red wine and spent the next 40 minutes doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was being Seraphina DeLuca at her grandfather's funeral. It was exhausting in the particular way that performing a role you've outgrown is exhausting. Senator Cardone touched her arm and told her Eduardo had been like a father to him. She smiled and did not say what she was thinking. A woman whose name she never caught talked for 6 minutes about the children's hospital. Seraphina listened and asked a question at the right moment, and the woman seemed satisfied. Her cousin Marco appeared briefly, already slightly drunk, and pressed his forehead against hers and said, "I miss him," in a voice that cracked, and that was the closest she came to losing it, because Marco had been her only real ally in this family since they were children building forts in the East Wing. Then Marco was pulled away by someone, and she was alone again near the edge of the room, and the crowd had thickened, and the string quartet had shifted to something slower, and she needed air the way you need it when you've been underwater too long and your lungs have stopped asking politely. The balcony off the east side of the hall was accessed through a set of French doors that most people ignored. She remembered it from childhood. It overlooked the garden, and in summer you could see fireflies moving through the hedgerows from up there. She slipped through the doors without looking to see if anyone noticed. Outside, the rain came at her immediately. The balcony had a narrow overhang that caught most of it, but not all. The air was cold and wet and smelled like stone and wet earth, and somewhere beneath that, the faint diesel exhaust of the cars in the driveway. She gripped the iron railing with both hands and breathed. The first tears came without warning or ceremony. One moment she was standing there breathing, the next her vision was blurring and she was pressing the back of her hand hard against her mouth because she would not make a sound. She refused. She had not come all this way to fall apart on a balcony in front of a garden full of cars belonging to criminals and politicians. She was still standing like that 2 minutes in when the French doors opened behind her. She didn't turn around. "The bar's inside," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I know where the bar is." Roman's voice was low and unhurried. He had one of those voices that didn't need to be loud to carry. It had a quality like something moving through stone rather than over it. "I saw you leave." She turned then because turning away from him felt like a concession she wasn't prepared to make. He was standing just inside the overhang's edge, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not pity, not concern exactly, something more careful than either of those. "How long have you been in the city?" he asked. "Since Monday." He nodded like this information was going into some private ledger. "Your mother said 2 days. My mother says a lot of things that are adjacent to the truth." She turned back to the railing. "Why are you out here?" A pause. Behind them, through the glass doors, she could hear the muted sounds of the funeral continuing without them. Voices, the string quartet, the delicate percussion of crystal and silver. "Eduardo asked me to look after you," Roman said, "before he died." That landed somewhere unexpected. She gripped the railing a little tighter. "He didn't tell me that. He knew you'd fight it. He was right." She looked out at the dark garden, the hedgerows moving in the rain. "I don't need looking after. I'm a doctor. I look after other people." "You're a medical student." "I graduated 4 months ago." She glanced at him sideways. "Almost doctor. Close enough." Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Congratulations." "Thank you," she exhaled. The cold air was helping. The tears had receded back to wherever they'd come from, biding their time. "You can go back inside. I'm fine." He didn't move. She turned to look at him fully then, because he was doing the thing he'd always done, the thing that had driven her halfway insane since she was 16 years old. He was just standing there, being entirely unconcerned with whether his presence was welcome, not aggressive about it, not apologetic either, just there in the way that large, unmovable things are there. "Roman." "Seraphina." "I'm telling you I'm fine." "I know." "Then why are you still out here?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in the wet dark with the rain coming down around them and the colored light from the stained glass casting its fragments across the balcony floor, something passed between them that she could feel but not name. It was not new, exactly. It was something that had been there in some form since she was 17, and she'd been very good at not acknowledging it, and now standing here on the worst night she'd had in years. Her defenses were considerably thinner than usual. "Because he was my friend," Roman said finally, "for 30 years. And I don't particularly want to stand in there shaking hands with men who are already calculating what his absence means for them." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She looked at him again, really looked, not the sideways, careful glances she'd been parceling out. And she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Grief. Real, unperformed grief, sitting beneath the controlled exterior like water beneath ice. "Me either," she said quietly. They stood there for a while without talking. The rain came down. Somewhere in the garden, a branch cracked under the weight of the water. After a while, Roman moved to stand beside her at the railing, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth coming off him against the cold air. "He talked about you," Roman said. "Every time you called." She didn't say anything. "He kept a photograph of you on his desk. You in your white coat." A pause. "He showed everyone who came into his office." She pressed her lips together. The tears were threatening again. "He was very proud of you," Roman said. "He wanted you to know that." "He told me," she said, and her voice was rough now, scraped thin. "He told me every time we talked." "I know." "He told me he told you. He wanted to make sure you actually believed it." That broke something small and essential inside her chest. She gripped the railing and breathed and did not make a sound. And Roman did not look at her or reach for her or do any of the things that would have shattered whatever was left of her composure. He just stood there, present and quiet, letting her grieve without treating it like a problem to solve. After a long time, she said, "Thank you." He nodded once. They went back inside 10 minutes later, separately, because she needed another minute, and because walking back in together would have produced exactly the kind of speculation she didn't have the energy for tonight. She got through the rest of the funeral, but something had shifted, somewhere, in the space between the rain and the railing and the quietly spoken grief of a man she'd spent years trying to think of as nothing more than her grandfather's associate. She should have been paying attention to that shift. She wasn't. Celeste DeLuca was a beautiful woman in the way that very dangerous things can be beautiful. The kind of beauty that has been maintained and weaponized over years until it is no longer quite separate from threat. She was 53 years old, black-haired, with the bone structure of a woman from northern Italian old money, and the eyes of someone who has been in rooms where ugly decisions were made for so long that ugliness no longer particularly registers. She came to Seraphina's room at 10 the following morning. She knocked once, which was courtesy, and opened the door without waiting for an answer, which was habit. "I need you to stay in Milan," she said. Seraphina was sitting on the bed with a coffee and her phone, catching up on emails from the hospital in New York, where she'd recently started as a junior resident. She looked up. "For how long?" 3 months, perhaps 4. Celeste moved to the window, looked out at the garden with an expression Seraphina associated with her mother doing calculations. "There are matters that require the family's visible presence, agreements that need to be renegotiated now that your grandfather—" She stopped. A barely perceptible pause. "Now that Eduardo is gone, I have a job. I've spoken to Dr. Armano. Your residency can be deferred." Seraphina set her coffee down carefully. "You've already spoken to my program director. I handled it. Without asking me." "I'm asking you now." Celeste turned from the window. Her expression was composed and implacable. "Sarah, I need you here, not as an asset, as my daughter." That last sentence landed differently than the ones before it, and they both knew it. Seraphina looked at her mother's face for signs of softness and found them in the very slight tension around her eyes, which was as close as Celeste DeLuca came to visible emotion. She thought about New York, the hospital, the quiet apartment she'd spent 3 years building into something that felt like hers. She thought about the 11 hours back across the ocean and the way she'd felt pressing her forehead against the airplane window, watching the lights of Milan disappear beneath the clouds. 3 months, Seraphina said. "Then I go back." Celeste nodded once, as if this had been the outcome she'd expected. There's one other matter. She moved toward the door, paused. I've asked Roman to keep an eye on things while I'm handling business in Florence next week. He'll be nearby, if you need anything. Seraphina kept her face neutral. I don't need a babysitter. Consider it security. Celeste was already half out the door. The transition period is delicate. There are men who will test boundaries they wouldn't have tested while your grandfather was alive. I'd rather you were not in situations I couldn't manage from Florence. Mama? Celeste looked back. I'm not 17 anymore. A pause. Something moved across her mother's face. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite apology. Then she was gone, the door clicking softly behind her. Seraphina sat alone in the room she'd grown up in, surrounded by the furniture of her childhood, and the particular silence of a house that was learning, slowly and unwillingly, how to exist without the person it had been built around. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She lasted 4 days before she broke. In her defense, 4 days in the Moretti estate in the immediate aftermath of Eduardo's funeral, surrounded by family members conducting themselves with the quiet intensity of people renegotiating power structures while pretending to mourn, was approximately 4 days more than most people could have managed. It started small. She borrowed one of the estate's cars at 9 in the evening and drove into the city without telling anyone. She found a bar in the Navigli district that was not the kind of bar DeLuca women were supposed to know about. Underground, loud, crammed with people who were simply trying to have a good Friday night without thinking too hard about anything. She ordered a drink, then another. Someone asked her to dance. She said yes because it was easier than saying no, and because the music was loud enough to stop any thoughts from completing themselves. She was on her third drink and her second dance when she became aware of the man at the edge of the room who had been watching her for 20 minutes. Not dancing, not drinking, just watching, with the particular stillness of someone who is not there to have a good time, but has a different purpose entirely. She excused herself from the man she'd been dancing with, who looked disappointed but not surprised, and moved toward the bar. Her pulse was up, not from dancing. She kept her eyes forward but watched the watcher in her peripheral vision. He was moving toward her. She turned, put her drink on the bar, and the man was close now, younger than she'd thought, maybe 30, with the kind of face that was handsome in a way that felt deliberate, and a leather jacket that cost more than it was supposed to suggest. Seraphina DeLuca, he said. Not a question. You have the wrong person. I really don't. His smile was thin. Your Uncle Bruno sends his regards. Her Uncle Bruno was her mother's brother and had been quietly cut out of the family business 4 years ago over disagreements that nobody had fully explained to Seraphina, but that she understood, in the way she'd learned to understand things in this family, to be about money and betrayal and probably violence. He was not a man who sent regards through strangers at bars in good faith. She stepped back. Her heel caught on someone behind her and she turned, and there was a second man, larger, standing close enough that the step back had brought her directly in contact with his chest. She opened her mouth. She's with me. Roman's voice came from her left, quiet and absolutely certain, and the effect it had on both men was immediate and unmistakable. The one with the smile went still. The one behind her stepped back. Roman stepped into the space between her and the two men as though space simply reorganized itself around him when he decided it should. He wasn't touching her. He didn't need to. He stood there with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the two men with an expression of such complete and terrifying calm that the one with the smile took a step back of his own. Tell Bruno, Roman said, that this was a mistake. The two men left. The whole thing had taken perhaps 45 seconds. Seraphina turned to look at Roman. He was watching the two men move toward the exit, and then he turned to look at her, and she saw the anger in his eyes. Not explosive, not hot, but the cold contained anger of someone who is furious and has a lot of practice at not showing it. How long have you been here? She asked. Long enough. You followed me. Your mother asked me to. How long? She said flatly. Have you been in this bar? A brief pause. 40 minutes. You've been watching me for 40 minutes without saying anything. You looked like you needed the night. He looked back toward the exit. The two men were gone. And you were fine. Until you weren't. She should have been angrier. She knew that. She should have told him exactly where he could put his 40 minutes of surveillance and his cold calm and his perfect timing. Instead, what she felt, standing there with her heart still beating too fast from something that had been much closer to real danger than she'd admitted to herself in the moment. What she felt was something uncomfortably close to relief. "I'm leaving," she said. "I'll drive you." "I have a car." "You've had 3 drinks." He held her gaze. "I'll drive you." She wanted to argue. The argument was right there, well constructed, ready to deploy. She looked at his face and at the door through which Bruno's men had just disappeared, and she thought about the 40-minute drive back to the estate alone, in a car that anyone with access to the right information would know was from the DeLuca garage. "Fine," she said. They walked out into the cold night, and Seraphina felt the residual fear and adrenaline settling into something quieter, and she was aware of Roman walking half a step behind her and slightly to her left, in the specific way of someone who is maintaining a physical perimeter without making it obvious. And she thought about how she had spent 5 years learning how to exist in a world that had nothing to do with this one, and how quickly, in the space of 4 days and one close call in a bar, that world had started feeling very far away. She didn't say anything on the drive back. Neither did he. But when he pulled up in front of the estate and she got out and started toward the door, she stopped and turned back. "Roman." He looked at her through the window. "Thank you," she said. The same 2 words she'd said on the balcony in the rain. They landed differently this time. He nodded once and drove away, and Seraphina stood in the cold looking after the car until its taillights disappeared through the estate gates. She went inside. She did not sleep for a long time. What? Over the following 2 weeks, it happened in increments. It was not a sweep. It was not one dramatic moment of capitulation. It was the slow accumulation of hours spent in proximity to a person who was categorically different in private than the world believed him to be in public, and the way that accumulation pressed against everything she'd decided to believe about him. He showed her a cafe in the Brera district that had been run by the same family for 60 years, tucked into a lane so narrow the tables were half inside and half outside, regardless of weather, where the owner knew Roman by name and brought espresso without being asked. He was different there, quieter in a way that wasn't the strategic quiet she'd always associated with him, but something that looked uncomfortably like peace. He took her to a rooftop garden above a building she would never have been able to identify from the street, maintained by a man who had been a florist before the city had swallowed him sideways, and who was still growing dahlias in terracotta pots 16 floors above the criminal underworld that had absorbed him. Roman spoke to this man the way you speak to someone whose company you genuinely value, not whose usefulness you are maintaining. These things were disturbing in proportion to how much they mattered. She had constructed a very functional understanding of Roman Valenti over the years. He was her grandfather's right hand. He was dangerous. He was competent in the way that weapons are competent. He was off limits in ways that were so numerous and overlapping that enumerating them felt almost comic. This understanding had served her well precisely because it left no room for the alternative, for the possibility that he was also someone who knew every hidden cafe and rooftop garden in Milan, who grieved genuinely and privately, who stood in the rain on balconies without apology, who made rooms feel safer simply by being in them. She was arguing with him in the car after the 3rd time he'd intervened when she'd pushed too far into an uncomfortable neighborhood late in the evening. She'd been visiting a patient's family. It was legitimate. She wasn't being reckless. She'd explained this 3 times already. And he cut her off mid-sentence. "I know you weren't being reckless," he said. She blinked. "Then why?" "Because the people who want to test what your grandfather's death means for your family don't distinguish between reckless and legitimate." He kept his eyes on the road. His jaw was tight. "It doesn't matter to them why you're there. It matters that you're a DeLuca in a neighborhood where they can get to you." A silence. "You could have said that instead of—" she started. "I'm saying it now." "You're infuriating," she said. "I know." He said it without any particular inflection, as if this were factual information he'd absorbed long ago and made his peace with. She looked at his profile for a long moment, the scar below his ear, the silver hair, the hands on the wheel, large and unhurried, the hands of a man who had done things with them that she knew about abstractly and did not examine too closely. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. The question came out more direct than she'd intended. "To what?" "To watching me. To all of this." She gestured at the car, the city outside, the whole arrangement that had somehow consumed her last 2 weeks. "You're not an errand boy. You're not—" She stopped. "You don't do this for people." A long pause. "Eduardo was my friend," he said finally. "For 30 years. That's not an answer." He glanced at her then, briefly, and she caught something in his expression before he looked away. Something that was there and then gone, shuddered, controlled, but she'd seen it. Her breath came slightly short. She looked back out at the road and did not say anything else. And Roman did not say anything else. And they drove the rest of the way to the estate in silence that had changed its quality entirely from what it had been before. She was in trouble. She had known it for days. She was only now allowing herself to know it consciously, which she understood was already too late. The greenhouse on the south end of the estate property was supposed to be locked. She'd been climbing through its broken side panel since she was 14 and using it as a place to think since she was 16. The white orchids had been there when she arrived and were still there, hundreds of them in varying stages of bloom, tended by someone on staff who had apparently maintained them through Eduardo's decline and death without being asked, because that was the kind of staff the Moretti estate kept. She went there on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after her return, with a bottle of wine and the intention of being alone. She heard the door behind her 20 minutes in. She didn't turn around. "I'm not in danger," she said. "I know," Roman said. "Then why—" "I saw the light." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway of the greenhouse with his jacket over his arm and his sleeves rolled up in the way he wore them when he'd been working. She'd learned to read these small things, the rolled sleeves, the loosened button, the particular way his posture changed when he thought no one was watching. And he was looking at her with an expression she'd been trying to decode for weeks, and had finally, in the last several days, stopped pretending she didn't understand. Roman. His name in her mouth felt like stepping off an edge. He stayed where he was. The thing about Roman Valenti, the thing that had driven her half out of her mind since she was old enough to understand it, was that he never pushed. He was a man who had built an empire through force and calculation and the willingness to go further than other men would. And in every other context she had ever observed him, he was absolutely certain of his next move. Not here, not with her. Here he stayed in doorways and waited, and the waiting was somehow more dangerous than anything else could have been. She put down her wine glass. She crossed the greenhouse. She kissed him. For exactly half a second he was still. Genuinely, completely still, every muscle in his body arrested. And then something gave way inside him with a force that she felt rather than heard, and his hands came up to hold her face with a gentleness that was in complete violent contradiction to the hands that were holding her, and he kissed her back. And the white orchid stood witness, indifferent and perfect, as the most feared man in Italy and the doctor who had spent 5 years building a life on the other side of the world stood in a greenhouse in the rain and destroyed every rule that had kept them safe from each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Seraphina pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his heartbeat. Fast, human, nothing like the controlled machine she'd constructed him to be in her mind. And she thought, this is the thing you can't take back. Roman said nothing for a long time. His hands were in her hair. Outside, the rain kept coming down. "Seraphina," he said finally, and his voice was completely wrecked. "I know," she said. "I know." A long silence. "I'm not sorry," she said. He exhaled. His arms tightened around her. "Neither am I," he said. And somewhere in the Moretti estate, in a study on the second floor where the lights were still burning, Celeste De Luca was on the phone with her driver, arranging her return from Florence 3 days early. Because she had her own ways of knowing things, had always had them, and something in the estate's silence over the past week had begun to sound wrong to her in ways she couldn't yet name but could not ignore. She would be home by morning, and by morning, everything would be different. Celeste De Luca arrived at 6:47 in the morning. Seraphina heard the car in the driveway from her bedroom window. She was already awake, had been awake for most of the night, which was its own kind of answer to questions she'd been avoiding asking herself. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel, then the particular sound of the front door opening with the quiet authority of someone who owns the house and knows it. She sat on the edge of her bed in yesterday's clothes and waited. Her mother did not come upstairs immediately. That was worse somehow than if she had. Seraphina could track her movements through the house by sound, the study door, the brief silence that meant her mother was looking at something on Eduardo's desk, the kitchen, the sound of the coffee machine running. Celeste De Luca, upon arriving home from a night drive from Florence, made coffee before doing anything else. It was the most consistent thing about her. 15 minutes passed. Then footsteps on the stairs. Seraphina stood up. The knock was the same as always. Once, firm, and then the door opened. Celeste came in wearing a dark gray travel coat that she hadn't removed, which meant she'd come up here before even putting her things down, which meant the 15 minutes of coffee had been preparation. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked at her daughter with those eyes that had always seen too much. And Seraphina looked back at her mother, and neither of them said anything for a beat that stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. Then Celeste said very quietly, "Tell me I'm wrong." Seraphina's jaw tightened. "About what?" "Don't." Her mother's voice was still quiet, but something had entered it, something cold and controlled, that Seraphina recognized as the register Celeste reserved for moments when she was working very hard not to become something louder. "Don't make me say it out loud if it isn't true. Just tell me I'm wrong." The silence answered for her. Celeste closed her eyes for 1 second. One precise, controlled second. Then she opened them again, and whatever she'd allowed herself to feel in that second was gone. "How long?" she said. It isn't what you're—" "How long, Seraphina?" "It's complicated." "It is not complicated." The quiet was gone now. Not loud yet, but gone. "He is 52 years old. He has worked beside this family for 30 years. He sat at your grandfather's table when you were a child. How long?" "Mama, answer me." "It started last night." Seraphina felt the inadequacy of those words the moment they left her mouth. Because last night was technically accurate and also completely false in the way that technically accurate things can be completely false. Last night was the first time anything happened, but it's been— She stopped. She pressed her fingers against her own collarbone, a habit from childhood she'd never shed. It's been building for longer than that. Her mother turned away from her and looked out the window at the early morning garden. Her shoulders were straight and rigid, and she stood so still that she looked like something being held together by sheer force of will, which was probably exactly what she was. "He knew," Celeste said, and her voice had changed again, stripped down now, almost to nothing. "He knew what you were to this family. He knew the position I trusted him to." She stopped, pressed her lips together. He didn't take advantage of anything." The sharpness in Seraphina's own voice surprised her. "I kissed him first. He almost stopped it." "Almost." "Yes, almost." She held her mother's gaze when Celeste turned back around. "I'm 24 years old, Mama. I'm not a child he manipulated. I made a choice." "You made a choice," Celeste repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like the most naive sentence she'd ever heard. "Sarah, this is not a boy from your medical school. This is not something you can simply—" She pulled in a breath. "Do you understand what Roman Valenti is? Not the man who brings you to cafes and watches over you. What he actually is. What he has done." "I grew up in this house," Seraphina said. "I know what the people in this family are." "Then you know why this is impossible." "I know why you think it's impossible." They stared at each other across the bedroom. Outside, a bird started in one of the garden trees, sharp and repetitive, and then stopped. "I'm going to handle this," Celeste said finally. Seraphina went cold. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to speak with Roman, and I'm going to make clear to him what the appropriate boundaries of his role in this family— No, have always been and will remain going forward." "Mama, no!" Seraphina stepped forward. "If you treat this like a business problem you can restructure, I will leave. I will go back to New York tonight, and I will not come back for the 3 months you asked me to stay. I will not come back for the family. I will not— Don't threaten me. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what I will do." Seraphina's voice was shaking slightly, and she couldn't stop it. "You asked me to stay?" "I stayed. But not if you're going to treat me like another piece of this that you get to manage." Something shifted in her mother's face. A crack in the architecture, small and quickly repaired, but there. Celeste looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her with a quietness that was somehow worse than if she'd slammed it. Seraphina sat back down on the bed. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Below, she heard the front door open and close. Roman was in the estate's east office, a room that had served as a kind of secondary operations space during Eduardo's later years when climbing the stairs to the main study had become difficult. When Celeste found him at 8:30 that morning, he was standing at the window with a phone to his ear, and when she opened the door, he ended the call without saying goodbye. He turned to face her. Celeste. DeLuca walked into the room and closed the door and stood in the middle of the floor and looked at him, and Roman looked back at her, and between them was 30 years of history that had just been irrevocably rearranged. "Tell me you didn't," she said. "Celeste, tell me." Her voice was quiet and precise and terrible. "Tell me you didn't let this happen." Roman did not look away. He had, over the course of 30 years, looked Celeste DeLuca in the eye through negotiations, through crises, through the deaths of people they both knew, through conversations that would have made other men look at the floor. He looked at her now with the same directness he'd always offered her, which she recognized and which, she realized, was about to be used against her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I can't tell you that," he said. The room was very still. "You have known her since she was 12 years old," Celeste said. "I know. You sat at Eduardo's table. You were there when he worried about her, when she was in New York and he was sick and he was afraid she wouldn't come home in time." "I know, Celeste." "Then how?" She was not asking how in the sense of requesting an explanation. She was asking it the way you ask something when the answer is incomprehensible, and you are demanding that the universe justify itself. "How do you stand here, and how?" "Because it was inevitable," he said, "and I know that is the worst possible thing I could say to you right now. And I am saying it anyway, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." She crossed the room in 4 steps and slapped him across the face. It was not a dramatic slap. It was a single, precise strike from a woman who had spent her entire adult life in rooms full of violence and had absorbed the lesson that force is most effective when it is controlled. Roman's head turned with it and then turned back, and there was a spot of red on his cheekbone. He did not move. "That's the first one," she said. Her voice was shaking now in a way it hadn't been before. "You get that one for free." He looked at her and said nothing. "She is my daughter." Celeste's voice cracked on the last word, a hairline fracture in the architecture, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for 1 second before she looked back at him. "She is 24 years old, and she has spent her entire life trying to get away from everything this world is, and you—" She stopped. "You are this world. You are the worst of it. You are everything she has been trying not to become." "I know what I am," Roman said. His voice was quiet. "I have always known what I am." "Then you should have known better." "Yes." A pause. "I should have." The admission landed between them with a weight that was almost physical. Celeste looked at him for a long time. The red mark on his cheekbone was darkening. She stood very still in the center of the room, and Roman stood very still at the window, and outside the morning continued without them, the garden going from gray light to gold as the sun cleared the estate walls. "I trusted you," she said finally, and those 3 words carried 30 years inside them. "I know." His jaw worked. "I know you did. And now I don't know." He looked at the floor, then back up at her. "I wish I could tell you that nothing happened. I wish I could give you back the version of last night where I saw the light in the greenhouse and turned around and went back to bed. I can't. And I won't lie to you about it." "Noble," Celeste said bitterly. "No, just what you deserve from me after 30 years. She exhaled. It came out shaking. She turned away from him and moved toward the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "End it," she said without turning around. "Whatever this is, end it. Tell her it was a mistake. She's young enough that she'll survive it, and she will hate me for a while, and then she'll go back to New York and she'll become the doctor she's supposed to be. And in 10 years she will understand why this was the right decision." A silence. "And if I don't," Roman said. She turned around. "Then you are no longer welcome in this family." she said. In any capacity. Everything Eduardo built between us, everything the last 30 years built, it ends. Roman looked at her. I'm sorry, Celeste, he said. Don't. Her voice was hard now, the crack sealed back over. Don't be sorry. Make the right decision. She left. Roman stood at the window for a long time looking out at the garden, where the gold morning light was moving through the hedgerows, and somewhere across the city, above the noise and the traffic and the 9 million ordinary lives being lived, he could feel the whole architecture of everything he'd built shifting on its foundation. He was 52 years old. He had made decisions that ended lives and others that built things that would outlast him, and he had long ago accepted that the mathematics of his world ran only one direction. He had never expected at this point to be standing in a room trying to do the math on something he had no language for. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. I'll try it. He found Seraphina in the library at 10 in the morning with a medical textbook open on the desk in front of her and a cup of cold coffee at her elbow, and the look on her face of someone who has been staring at the same page for an hour without reading it. She looked up when he came in. She read his face in approximately 3 seconds, and he watched her do it, watched the slight shift in her expression as she registered what she was seeing. She talked to you, Seraphina said. Not a question. This morning. She closed the textbook, pushed it aside, folded her hands on the desk in a way that reminded him suddenly and painfully of Celeste. The same bone structure, the same deliberate stillness, and he had to look away for a moment. What did she say? Seraphina said. A number of things. He moved into the room, didn't sit, stopped near the window that looked out over the estate's front drive. She slapped me. A brief silence. Good. He looked at her. Something like a bleak smile crossed his face and disappeared. Yes. Roman. She said his name the way she'd said it the previous night, like stepping off something, and he felt it in his chest. Whatever she asked you to do, I need you to tell me. He looked at her. End it, he said. She wants me to tell you it was a mistake, that it won't happen again. He paused. That you should go back to New York and forget it. Seraphina held his gaze. Her expression was very still. And I'm not going to do that. The stillness broke. Something moved through her face, relief and fear in the same instant, which was an uncomfortable combination because they had no business being there together. She'll cut you out, Seraphina said. Everything with the family. 30 years. I know. Roman, that's your entire... She stopped. I'm not worth that. You don't even know if this is... We don't know what this is yet. I know what it is. He said it simply, without dramatics, the way he said things that were already decided. I've known for longer than I allowed myself to admit. She stood up from the desk. She crossed the room and stopped an arm's length from him and looked up at his face, and he could see her processing it all. Her mother, the ultimatum, the 30 years, the math of what he was saying. And he could see her reaching for the responsible thing to say, the sensible argument, the version of this where she talked him back from the edge. You're 52, she said. Yes. I'm 24. Yes. I'm a first-year resident. I'm barely a person yet. In terms of what I want my life to be, I haven't... Seraphina? I'm serious. I came here to bury my grandfather and go back to New York. I didn't come here to... She gestured between them, a short, frustrated motion. This wasn't supposed to happen. I know. So maybe she's right. Maybe we should... Do you believe that? He said. The question stopped her. Do you actually believe that? He said. Or are you saying it because it's the version that doesn't cost anything? She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw moved. A muscle in her cheek tightened and released. That's not fair, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She turned away from him and went to the window and stood there looking out. And he watched her shoulders rise and fall with a slow breath. And he waited, because that was what he did. He waited, and eventually she turned back around. I don't know what this is, she said. Her voice was different now, scraped down to something raw. But I know it's real. And I know that last night in the greenhouse, I wasn't confused. I wasn't drunk, and I wasn't looking for something to rebel against, and it wasn't about any of those things. I know, he said. so I can't pretend it wasn't real. I can't tell you it was a mistake." She pressed her fingers to her collarbone, that old childhood habit. "But I'm not going to ask you to throw away 30 years either." "You're not asking me," he said. "I'm deciding." "Roman, Seraphina." His voice was quiet but absolute. "I have made decisions in my life that were wrong. I have made them with full knowledge that they were wrong, and I made them anyway because the math worked. This is not that. This is the first decision I have made in 30 years that feels like it is actually right, and I am not going to unmake it because it is inconvenient." The library was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time. Then she walked toward him and stopped very close and looked up at his face. "You should know," she said quietly, "that I am genuinely terrified." "Of what?" "Of what this means for both of us." A pause. "Of what you are, and whether that can coexist with what I'm trying to be." He looked at her steadily. "Those are legitimate fears. I know they are. I'm not saying them to push you away. I'm saying them because you need to know what you're getting into. I'm not going to pretend I'm fine with things I'm not fine with. I'm not going to look away from the parts of your world that I find unacceptable." Her jaw was set now, chin slightly raised. "If this is real, then I need it to be real. Not managed, not protected, real." He looked at her face, the grief still sitting underneath it from 3 weeks ago, and the intelligence that was never quite off, and the stubbornness that had driven Celeste DeLuca to distraction for 24 years, and that he had always, privately, found magnificent. "Real," he said. "Yes." He reached up and touched her face, one hand, just the edge of his thumb against her cheekbone, and she closed her eyes for a second and opened them again. "Real," he repeated. "But the thing about consequences is that they rarely arrive alone. The first week after Celeste returned was a Cold War conducted with surgical precision. Meals were eaten in silence. Requests were relayed through staff. Celeste DeLuca moved through her own house with the contained fury of someone who has decided that if she cannot win the argument, she will at minimum not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her lose it. Roman, by unspoken agreement, reduced his visible presence at the estate. He came when needed for business matters, conducted them efficiently, and left. He did not seek Seraphina out in the house. They found each other in other ways, texts that were brief and careful and said more in their gaps than their content. A car that appeared at the end of her shift at the local clinic where she'd begun volunteering 3 days a week. Evenings in the city that didn't begin at the estate and didn't end there either. It was not sustainable. They both knew it. But the Cold War had its own momentum, and in the 3rd week something shifted its chemistry entirely. Seraphina came home at 9 on a Thursday evening to find the estate's front lights blazing and 2 cars in the driveway she didn't recognize. She came through the side entrance out of habit and heard voices in the front sitting room, her mother's, clipped and precise, and 2 male voices she didn't immediately place. She stood in the hallway and listened. The voices were talking about consolidation, about territories, about what Eduardo's absence had left available, and who had the standing to move into those spaces, and who was going to require more direct persuasion. They were talking about it with the casual fluency of men discussing real estate development, which was, she had understood since childhood, exactly what it was, except the property in question was power over neighborhoods and people and city infrastructure, and the persuasion being discussed was not financial. She heard her mother's voice agreeing to terms she should not have been agreeing to. She stood in the hallway for 3 minutes listening, and then she went upstairs. She called Roman. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Who is Aldo Farini?" she said, and there was a silence on his end that told her more than an answer would have. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice had changed completely. The warmth gone. Everything stripped back to the operational. "He's in our sitting room with another man I don't recognize, and my mother is making agreements with them." A brief silence. "Is she alone with them?" "Staff is in the house. Go to your room. Do not go back downstairs." A pause. "I mean that, Seraphina. Who is he?" "Go to your room." "Roman, who is he?" He exhaled. "Farini controls the Eastern Corridor. He has been waiting for Eduardo to die for 2 years because Eduardo was the only person between him and what he wants on the northern supply routes. If your mother is agreeing to terms with him tonight..." He stopped. It means she is making an arrangement that your grandfather would never have sanctioned. What kind of arrangement? The kind that gives Farini protection inside the family's operational structure in exchange for leaving the DeLuca core assets alone. His voice was flat. The kind that Eduardo refused 3 times in the last 4 years of his life because Farini's methods are… He stopped again. Are what? Not something your grandfather was willing to associate this family with. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. Below her, distantly, she could hear the murmur of voices from the sitting room. Her mother's voice, low and controlled, agreeing to something Eduardo Moretti had refused 3 times. She's scared, Seraphina said. She doesn't know how to hold this together without him, and she's scared, so she's making deals she thinks will stabilize things. Yes. And these deals are bad. Yes? How bad? A pause. The kind of bad that becomes very hard to undo. She pressed her hand against her forehead. Her heart was beating fast. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of understanding things you'd rather not understand. What do I do? Nothing tonight. Let her finish the meeting. Don't confront her tonight. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I'll come to the house. A brief pause, different in quality from the others. This is separate from everything else, Seraphina. Whatever is between your mother and me right now, this is separate from that. This is about protecting the family. She understood what he was saying. He was drawing a line between the personal and the operational, and he was doing it for her benefit as much as his own, because the operational Roman was someone she was still learning, and the personal Roman was someone she was just beginning to know, and conflating them in this moment would help neither of them. Okay, she said. Okay. A pause. Are you all right? Yes. She looked out her window at the dark garden. No. She exhaled. I'm fine. Those 3 things can't all be true simultaneously. Welcome to being 24, she said. A brief silence, and in it something that might have been a quiet exhale of reluctant amusement. Go to sleep, he said. Yeah. She paused. Roman. Yes. Thank you. A beat. Still. For all of it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, get some sleep. He ended the call. She lay back on the bed in her clothes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the voices below her, and thought about Eduardo refusing Farini 3 times, and her mother agreeing tonight, and what it meant when fear made people unmake the decisions that the people who loved them had made with their whole lives. She didn't sleep for a long time. Not. Roman came at 10 the next morning. She watched him from the upstairs window, the car, the unhurried walk to the front door, the way he moved through spaces like he'd already calculated every exit. She came downstairs and met him in the hallway before he reached the study door. He looked at her first. A quick read, checking something, and then he looked at the closed study door. She's been in there since 7, Seraphina said quietly. He nodded. She knows you're coming? I called ahead. She stepped aside. He moved toward the study door, stopped, looked back at her. This conversation is going to be ugly, he said. I know. You don't need to be here for it. I know that too. She held his gaze. Go ahead. He looked at her for one moment longer, and in that moment she saw something cross his face that she was beginning to learn to read. Not the operational face, not the controlled public face, but the underneath one, the one that was still in the process of deciding whether to trust being seen. Then it was gone, and he knocked twice on the study door and went in. She stayed in the hallway. She did not press her ear to the door. She was not 16 anymore, but she heard enough, because Celeste DeLuca's voice at its coldest carried, and Roman's voice at its flattest carried, and the conversation went, her mother, you had no right. Roman, Eduardo had every right, and he gave it to me. Her mother, Eduardo is dead. Roman, which is exactly why Farini came to you last night, which is why you should not have let him in. Her mother, you don't make decisions for this family anymore. You made that choice. Roman, Celeste, Farini will not honor whatever you agreed to. He doesn't make honorable agreements. He makes arrangements that benefit him until the moment they don't, and then he renegotiates with leverage. Her mother, I am aware of how this world works. Roman, Then act like it. A silence that went long enough to make Seraphina's shoulders tighten. Her mother's voice, quieter now and more dangerous for it. Get out of my house. Roman. Celeste. Get out. Each word clipped and separate. You are here because of her. Whatever relationship you believe you have with this family now runs through her. And I am telling you that the moment you walk out that door is the moment you lose access to this house, this family, and everything Eduardo built between us. That is the price of last week. Do you understand me? Seraphina pressed her back against the hallway wall. A long silence from inside the study. Then Roman's voice, very quiet. I understand you. Then choose. Another silence. The study door opened. Roman came out into the hallway and looked at Seraphina, and she looked at him, and they stood there in the space of what had just been said. His jaw was tight. He looked tired in a way she'd never seen him look tired before. Not physically, but in some other way, some deeper place that didn't often show. She's going to go through with the Farini arrangement, he said quietly. I heard. There are calls I have to make. People who need to know before this gets further. He paused. People who can apply pressure from directions Celeste won't see coming until it's too late for the arrangement to finalize. Seraphina looked at him. You're going to work around her. I'm going to protect her, whether she wants me to or not. She's going to find out. Yes. And when she does, the arrangement with Farini will already be finished. He held her gaze. And she can hate me for it. She stared at him. Roman, if you do this, you understand what you're doing, right? You're not just going around her on a business decision. You're taking the last thing she had, which was the authority to run this family without you, and you're overriding it. She will never... I know. His voice was very flat and very tired. I know exactly what I'm doing. Then why? He looked at her, and in his eyes was the answer to the question she'd asked in the library. Do you actually believe that? Or are you saying it because it's the version that doesn't cost anything? And she understood then that this was what it looked like when Roman Valenti made a decision from a place that was not calculation and not strategy, but something older and less manageable than either. Because she's your mother, he said, and you would never forgive me if I let her make this mistake. Seraphina said nothing. He touched her face once, the same brief gesture from the library, and then he was walking toward the front door, and she was standing in the hallway alone with the study door closed behind her, and her mother's silence pressing through the wood and the whole shape of everything changing again, as it had been changing continuously since the night of the funeral, as it apparently intended to keep changing until whatever was going to happen finally happened. She heard the front door close. She stood in the hallway. Then she opened the study door. Her mother was standing at Eduardo's desk with her back to the door and her hands flat on the desk surface and her head down. And for a moment, Seraphina saw her not as Celeste DeLuca, who ran things and managed assets and slapped men who betrayed her trust, but as a woman who was 53 years old and had just lost her father and the man she'd relied on for 30 years in the space of a month, and who was standing in her dead father's study at 10 in the morning trying to figure out how to hold a world together that had been built by someone else. Mama, Seraphina said. Celeste did not turn around. He's going to undo it, Seraphina said. Whatever you agreed to with Farini, he's going to work around it before it finalizes. I know, Celeste said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the architecture. I knew before he left the room. A silence. And you let him go, Seraphina said. Her mother finally turned around. Her eyes were dry. Celeste DeLuca did not cry where anyone could observe it, but she looked older than she had when she'd come into Seraphina's bedroom the morning before, as though the last 24 hours had settled into her in some way that was visible. He's right about Farini, she said, simply, without qualification. Seraphina looked at her mother. I know he's right, Celeste said. I knew last night. I made the arrangement anyway because I was... She stopped. Her jaw worked. Because I thought I didn't have another option. A pause. And because I was angry, and I wanted something to be in my control. The honesty of it was startling. In 24 years, Celeste DeLuca had never admitted to Seraphina that she'd made a decision out of anger. He's going to fix it, Seraphina said carefully. He's going to make Farini disappear as an option, her mother corrected. That is not the same as fixing it. It simply removes one bad choice and leaves me with the rest of the problem. Will you let him help? Actually help, not no. The word was immediate and unequivocal. Her mother's eyes met hers. Not while you two are... She stopped. Her lips pressed together. No. Seraphina looked at her mother's face and understood, with the particular clarity of exhaustion, that there was no version of this conversation today that resolved anything. The geometry of the situation was not yet ready to resolve. Too many forces were still in motion, Roman working his calls across the city, Celeste standing in her dead father's study with her hands flat on his desk, Farini somewhere in Milan recalculating his position. Okay, Seraphina said. Her mother looked at her. Okay, Seraphina said again, more quietly. Not today. She turned and went back into the hallway and went upstairs to her room and sat on her bed and called Roman. He answered on the first ring this time. It's done, he said before she could speak. Farini's people called back 20 minutes ago. The arrangement is off. She exhaled. How? She said. I know things about Farini that he does not know I know, Roman said. I reminded him of several of them. She did not ask for more detail. She was learning where the lines were. My mother knows you did it, she said. I expected that. She said you were right about him. A pause. That must have been painful for her to say. She didn't say it to you, she said it to me. Seraphina looked out the window at the garden below. Roman, this is... How long can we keep doing this? All of this. The Cold War, the managing around each other, the... She stopped. When does it stop being something we're navigating and start being something that's just how it is permanently? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. It was such an honest answer, so unlike the version of him that always seemed to know, that it landed differently than reassurance would have. I'm not going to spend the next 3 months like this, she said. Something has to move, one way or another. I know. I want you to come to the estate tonight, she said. Not for business, for dinner. A pause. All three of us. A silence. Seraphina, I know it's going to be awful. I know. She pressed her fingers to her collarbone. But we can't keep doing it through walls. You said you wanted real. This is what real looks like. A very long pause. What time? He said. 8. Another pause. I'll be there, he said. She ended the call. She went downstairs and stood in the doorway of the study. Her mother looked up. Dinner tonight, Seraphina said. 8 o'clock. All three of us. Celeste stared at her. You're asking me to sit at the same table as... I'm not asking. Seraphina kept her voice level. I'm telling you that I've invited Roman to dinner tonight and that it's going to happen and that it's going to be awkward and difficult and nobody is going to enjoy it. And that is exactly why it needs to happen, because the alternative is the three of us spending the next 2 months moving around each other in this house like pieces in a game that nobody wins. Her mother said nothing. 8 o'clock, Seraphina said. She turned and walked away before her mother could respond. And in the DeLuca estate, in the long, still afternoon before the dinner that would change everything again, the Cold War held its breath. And somewhere in the city, in an office high above the canals, Roman Valenti sat at his desk and stared at a phone he'd just put down and thought about the dinner table he hadn't sat at in 3 weeks, and the woman who had set it, and the cost of what the evening would ask of him. He thought about what Celeste had said in the study. You are no longer welcome in this family. He thought about Eduardo's voice on the phone 3 months before he died. Roman, if something happens to me, look after my granddaughter. She's the only one in that house who still has a chance at something clean. He thought about a greenhouse full of white orchids and the particular silence of a woman who had just made a decision that couldn't be unmade. He picked up his jacket. He had 3 hours. He thought about what he was going to say at that table. Not to Seraphina. He knew what he had to say to Seraphina. That part was terrifyingly simple. But to Celeste, to the woman who had trusted him with the things she loved most, and who had every reason to look at him across that dinner table tonight and see nothing but a man who had broken faith with 30 years. He thought about what he would say. He had 3 hours. He thought he might need 30 years. The dinner table seated 12, and they were 3. Seraphina had chosen the smaller dining room rather than the formal hall. A deliberate decision, the difference between a room that felt like a negotiation and a room that felt like a meal. The smaller room had a round table of dark walnut, low candles, and a window that looked onto the lit portion of the garden. She'd asked the kitchen to prepare something simple. No theater, no performance of DeLuca hospitality. She was already regretting the whole idea by 7:45. She stood at the window with a glass of water, not wine. She wanted to be completely clear-headed for whatever the next 2 hours produced, and watched the garden lights move slightly in the evening wind. And she thought about all the dinners she had sat through in this house as a child. The ones where she'd been old enough to sense the undercurrents, but too young to read them. The ones where Eduardo had talked about everything except what was actually being discussed, and the men around the table had nodded and smiled. And she'd watched it all with the particular attention of a child who has learned that the visible conversation and the real one are rarely the same. She heard her mother on the stairs at 7:50. Celeste came into the dining room wearing a charcoal blouse she wore when she wanted to communicate that she was taking something seriously without conceding that it required formality. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was composed in the specific way that meant she had decided to get through this evening by treating it as a thing to be endured rather than a thing that could hurt her. She looked at the table, at the 3 place settings. Then she looked at Seraphina. "If he is late," Celeste said, "I'm eating without him." "He won't be late," Seraphina said. He wasn't. At 8 o'clock precisely, the front door opened and Roman came through and handed his jacket to the staff and came to the dining room doorway and stopped. He looked at the table, at Celeste, at Seraphina. He was wearing a dark shirt. No jacket at dinner in the smaller room. Another deliberate calibration she recognized. He looked like a man who had spent 3 hours deciding how to be in this room and had landed on the version of himself that was neither the operational Roman nor the public Roman, but something in between. "Celeste," he said. "Roman," she said. Her voice was a wall. He came to the table and sat. Seraphina sat. Celeste sat. The food came. The first 10 minutes were conducted entirely in the language of people passing serving dishes and commenting on the weather and the city's upcoming civic renovations, a language Seraphina recognized as the DeLuca family's native tongue for situations too charged for actual speech. She let it run for 10 minutes, and then she put down her fork. "I need to say something," she said. Both of them looked at her. "I asked you both here because I'm tired of the walls," she said. "Not just the ones between you, the ones in this house in general. The ones that have been here since I was a child." She looked at her mother. "I grew up in this house not knowing what was real and what was performance, and which conversations were the actual ones, and which ones were the ones I was supposed to hear." She looked at Roman, "And I am trying very hard to build something with you that is not that. That is actually real." She looked back at her mother. "And I can't do that while you two are conducting this cold war around me like I'm a territory being contested." Silence. Celeste set down her own fork. "I have not treated you as—" Mama." Seraphina said it quietly, but with enough weight that her mother stopped. "You called my program director in New York and deferred my residency without asking me. You assigned Roman to watch me without telling me that's what it was. You made an arrangement with Farini last night." A slight tightening around her mother's eyes. "Because you were frightened and angry, and you didn't consult anyone, because consulting people means admitting you don't have all the answers, which is something you have never, in my memory, been willing to do." The dining room was very still. Celeste looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at Roman. "You told her about Farini," she said. "She called me when she heard the voices," Roman said. "She asked me a direct question. I answered it." "Of course you did." Her voice was tired rather than accusatory. "Yes," Roman said, "because she is not a child and she deserved to know." Another silence. Then, unexpected and quietly devastating, Celeste said, "Eduardo used to do the same thing." She was looking at the table. "Answer her direct questions. Tell her the things I thought she was too young to know." A pause. "I was always furious with him for it." Seraphina looked at her mother. "And he was always right," Celeste said, still looking at the table. "She handled it every time." The candles moved slightly in a draft from the window. Somewhere outside, a car moved down the street beyond the estate walls. I'm not asking you to forgive anything tonight, Seraphina said after a moment. I'm not asking for a resolution. I'm just asking for honesty. At this table, the actual conversation instead of the one we're supposed to be having. Her mother finally looked up. She looked at Seraphina, and then she looked at Roman, and she seemed to be doing some private and painful arithmetic. The Farini arrangement, she said to Roman. What you did to undo it, what did it cost you? Roman was quiet for a moment. Some information I would have preferred to keep. Information about yourself. Yes. Celeste absorbed this. Why? Because Eduardo would have done the same, and because... He paused. His jaw moved slightly. Because the alternative was watching you make a mistake that would take years to undo, and I could not do that and look at myself afterward. A silence that was different in quality from the ones before it. You could have walked away, Celeste said, when I told you to. You could have ended this. She moved one hand slightly, a gesture that encompassed everything. And gone back to your own business and let this family manage itself. Yes. Why didn't you? Roman looked at Celeste DeLuca across the table, in the candlelight, in her dead father's house, and he said the thing that Seraphina had heard him say only once before. The same words he'd used in the library, but they landed differently here, with her mother listening. Because I love your daughter, he said, and because 30 years does not disappear because it becomes inconvenient. The words sat in the room. Celeste looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her fork and resumed eating, and after a moment Roman did the same, and after another moment Seraphina did, and the dinner continued. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly, in the way of people who have stopped pretending, which was its own rough kind of progress. It was the most real meal Seraphina could remember eating in that house. She was still thinking about it 3 days later, when everything changed. But the call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Roman's phone. A number he recognized immediately, a number that should not have been calling him, a number that belonged to a man named Caruso, who ran logistics on the northeastern edge of Roman's operational territory, and who had been, for the past 8 years, reliably invisible and efficient and uncomplicated. The call was 40 seconds long. Roman listened to all 40 seconds without speaking, then ended the call and sat very still at his desk for approximately 90 seconds. And then he stood up and moved to the window and looked out at the canal below with an expression on his face that no one in his office that afternoon was experienced enough to read correctly. His assistant knocked twice and opened the door. Your 3 o'clock is, cancel it, Roman said without turning from the window. The door closed. He stood at the window for 6 more minutes. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls. Not to Caruso, not to anyone in his own organization, but to 2 men who operated in the information business. The kind of information business that had no official name and required no formal contract. He asked them specific questions and told them he needed answers within 4 hours. He had answers within 2. He sat in his office with the answers laid out in front of him. Not in documents. Everything that mattered in his world existed in people's memories and spoken words, documented nowhere. And he looked at them and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of the ground moving beneath his feet. He thought about Damien Russo. He thought about Seraphina. He called her. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice slightly breathless. She'd been at the clinic, he could tell from the background sounds, the institutional hum of a small medical facility. Hey, I'm between patients. I have about 4 minutes. I need you to come to my office after your shift, he said. A pause. She'd heard something in his voice. What happened? After your shift. Roman, what happened? Not on the phone. He kept his voice level. After your shift, tell me when you're done and I'll send a car. A longer pause. She had, over the past month, developed a reasonably good calibration for when to push him and when to wait. And he was aware of her making that calculation now. 5 o'clock, she said. Good. He ended the call. He spent the next 3 hours making more calls, and what he learned over those 3 hours assembled itself into a picture so precise and so ugly that by 4:30 he was past the stage of shock and into the colder, more functional state that followed it. The state where the emotion became fuel rather than noise, and the calculations started running clean. Damian Russo had been planning this for 4 months. Not since Eduardo's death. Before. He had begun building the framework for it before Eduardo died, which meant either extraordinary prescience or, and this was the part that made Roman's hands very still on his desk, foreknowledge. Someone had told Russo that Eduardo was dying before it became public knowledge. Someone inside the network of people who knew Eduardo's medical condition, which was a very small network, had fed that information to a man who had then spent 4 months quietly constructing the architecture of what came next. What came next was Roman, not the family. Roman specifically. Russo wanted Roman, but his territory, his operational structure, the particular leverage points that Roman had built over 30 years that could not be replicated quickly or easily. And Russo was smart enough to know that taking those things by force would be expensive and uncertain. He needed another way. He needed Roman destabilized. He needed Roman's attention divided, his loyalties complicated, his usual clean decision-making compromised. The greenhouse. The funeral. The careful, patient watching. Roman sat at his desk and thought about a balcony in the rain and a greenhouse full of white orchids and a woman who had come home from New York to bury her grandfather, and he asked himself the question he did not want to ask. Then he picked up the phone and called Caruso back. "The surveillance on the DeLuca estate," he said. "When did it start?" Caruso was quiet for a moment. 4 months ago. Before Eduardo died. Yes. You're certain? I have the logs. 4 months and 6 days before the funeral. A pause. Roman, I should have told you sooner. I thought it was standard positioning. I didn't think... Who authorized it? It came through Farini's network, but the money was Russo's. Roman ended the call. He sat for a long time. The timing was not coincidental. Nothing in his world was coincidental. 4 months of surveillance on the DeLuca estate meant 4 months of watching Seraphina's routines, her calls with Eduardo, her visits, her return flight from New York after the funeral. It meant someone had been watching the night of the funeral, watching the balcony, watching whatever was visible through the glass. It meant something far worse than that. He thought about all the small moments of the past month, the bar where Bruno's men had approached her. Bruno, who had been cut out of the family 4 years ago, who had every reason to want leverage over the DeLuca estate. The timing of Celeste's Farini arrangement, the way it had appeared the moment Seraphina was drawn into the middle of it. He thought about it all, and he felt, at the bottom of everything, a fury so cold and so complete that it was almost peaceful. He was still sitting there at 5:15 when Seraphina walked through his office door. She took one look at him and stopped. "You're scaring me," she said. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He told her. Not all of it at once. He told it in the order he'd learned it, which was not clean or linear but assembled itself as he spoke, and he watched her face through all of it. The initial careful attention, the first furrowing of her brow, and then the moment it shifted, the moment she started to understand the shape of what he was saying, and he watched the color go slightly from her face. 4 months, she said when he finished. Before the funeral. Yes. So when I came home. She stopped. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. When you were on the balcony, when everything... That had nothing to do with Russo, Roman said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. What happened between us, that is not something that was engineered. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She looked at him, I know what I felt on that balcony, he said. I have known it for longer than that. Whatever Russo was planning, he could not have predicted what you were going to be to me when you came back. But he used it, she said. Her voice was very flat. Roman was quiet for a moment. He saw an opportunity in it. He used it. She said it again, harder, like the second iteration was for herself rather than him. He watched us. He watched us in the greenhouse or after, or... She stopped. He watched, and then he started the bar. Bruno's men. That was a provocation, Roman said, to see how I'd respond, to confirm what he suspected about what you were to me. She stood up from the chair. Good. She walked to the window of his office, the same window he'd been standing at 3 hours before, looking out over the same canal. She stood there with her back to him, and her arms wrapped around her own body, and he watched her from the desk and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make the shape of it any less ugly. So the dinner, she said. My idea to have the three of us at the table. Seraphina, was that useful to him? Having me busy trying to fix things with my mother while he was... She turned around. Her face was set in an expression he'd never seen on her before. Not anger exactly, something harder than anger. What is he going to do? He's going to move against me, Roman said. He's been waiting for the right moment. My attention on you and your family has left certain operational gaps that he's been quietly preparing to use. He paused. He will move in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I'm certain of it. How certain? Certain enough to have already started recalibrating. She looked at him. And me? Is he going to use me? A pause. He has considered it, Roman said carefully. That means yes. It means he has considered it as a tactic and has not yet acted on it, and I intend to ensure he does not have the opportunity. She crossed the room back to the chair and sat again, and she looked at him with those eyes that were always doing too much at once, calculating and feeling simultaneously, the two things that most people in his world had learned to separate if they survived long enough. I need to know something, she said. Ask. All of this, what you've been doing this past month, being at the estate, watching out for me and my mother, the Farini situation. Was any of that, did any of it happen because of Russo? Because he was watching and you knew it or suspected it and you were... She stopped. Tried again. Did you stay close to me to use me as bait? The question landed like a physical thing. Roman looked at her without flinching. He understood why she was asking and he did not resent it. And he also understood that the answer he gave in the next 30 seconds would determine something that could not be undetermined. No, he said. She held his gaze. I did not know about Russo's surveillance until today, he said. Everything I did in the past month I did because of Eduardo and because of your mother and because of you, not because of a strategy. A pause. I am telling you this knowing that you have no particular reason to believe me, given the world I operate in and the methods I use. I am telling you because it is true. She looked at him for a very long time. He waited. I believe you, she said finally. He exhaled. I also think, she said, that the fact I believe you might be exactly what Russo is counting on. He looked at her. If I trust you, she said, her voice steady and awful with clarity, then I'm accessible to you. I don't run back to New York, I stay here. And if I'm here, I'm a variable he can use. A pressure point. Something to hold over your head. She pressed her fingers to her collarbone. And you know that. Yes. You've known it since you got the call this afternoon. Yes. And you called me anyway. Her voice changed slightly. You told me anyway. You could have handled this without telling me. You could have made arrangements to deal with Russo without... I could have, he said. I decided not to. Why? The same question she kept asking him. Why? And he kept having only one answer, the same one, which was not a strategic answer and not a calculated answer, but the only answer he had. Because you asked for real, he said. And this is real. She sat very still. Outside, Milan moved through its evening. Traffic on the canal road, the clatter of a city that did not know or care about any of this. The ordinary world running parallel to theirs like two rivers sharing a bank but never the same water. What do we do? She said. And before Roman could answer, before he could begin to explain the calls he'd already made, and the recalibrations he'd already started, and the very careful set of countermoves he was assembling against a man who had spent 4 months preparing to use the people Roman loved as weapons, his phone buzzed on the desk between them. He looked at it. One text. A number he did not recognize. 4 words. We have your mother, but... The world contracted to the size of those 4 words. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand. He was calling his security chief before he'd finished reading the message a second time. Seraphina had seen his face change. She was watching him with a terror she was working to contain, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. What? She said. Roman. What? He showed her the phone. She made a sound that was barely audible and immediately stood up. Sit down, he said, and his voice had changed completely, stripped of everything except operational precision. Seraphina, sit down and don't move. That's my mother. I know. Sit. Down. He was already on the second call, his security chief's voice in his ear rattling off what he knew. which was not enough, not yet. The estate had been breached 20 minutes ago, 2 cars, 6 men. Celeste had been taken from the study. Staff were unharmed. They had been looking for Seraphina too, but she hadn't been at the estate. He ended the call. He looked at Seraphina. She was standing, not sitting, jaw locked, eyes very bright, shaking slightly in a way she clearly did not know she was doing. "My mother," she said. "I know. He took my mother because without you, he still needed something." She was working it out even now, even in this moment, the analytical brain running underneath the fear. "She's the substitute. He couldn't get to me, so he took—" "Seraphina, stop." He crossed the room to her and took her face in his hands and made her look at him directly. "I need you to listen to me, right now. Are you listening?" She focused on his eyes, nodded. "Russo has your mother. He did this because he wants me to respond immediately, without thinking, while my attention is on you and your fear for her. He wants me to move fast and make mistakes." He held her gaze. His thumbs were pressed against her cheekbones, and he could feel that she was trembling, and he kept his own voice absolutely flat, because the flatness was the only thing he had to offer her right now that was useful. "I am not going to do that. Roman, I'm going to get your mother back. I promise you this. But I'm going to do it correctly. And correctly means not moving for the next 40 minutes while I gather information and position people, and it means you staying here in this office where I know you are safe." Her eyes were filling. She blinked hard, twice, and they cleared. "He knew," she said. "He knew I wouldn't be at the estate. He knew I was here. He's still watching." "Yes." "So he knows you know." "He intended me to know." Roman held her face and looked at her. "This is the move he's been building for 4 months. Taking your mother forces me to respond publicly, in a way that exposes my network, that costs me the operational leverage I've been maintaining. He wants me visible. He wants me cornered." A pause. "And the only reason he believes this will work," Roman stopped. She finished it for him, "is because of me. Because he knows you won't risk making a mistake that costs my family." The candor of it, of her saying it out loud, hit him somewhere raw. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, his hand still holding her face. "Then we have to change what he knows," she said. He looked at her. "He thinks I'm the thing that makes you slow down," she said. Her voice had steadied. The trembling was still there, but contained now, controlled, the doctor part of her taking over from the terrified daughter part. "He thinks loving me makes you careful instead of dangerous." "He may be right," Roman said. "Or," she said, and her chin came up slightly in the way he recognized, "it makes you dangerous in a way he hasn't accounted for." He looked at her face. He thought about Eduardo, 3 months before he died, on the phone. She's the only one in that house who still has a chance at something clean. He thought about 30 years of decisions made in rooms without windows, decisions that had cost things he had not always let himself account for, decisions made by a man who had kept himself from caring too much about any specific thing, because caring too much about specific things was how men in his world got destroyed. He thought about the greenhouse. He thought about 4 words on a phone screen and the face of the woman standing in front of him, and the understanding, cold and complete and irrevocable, that Damien Russo had made in targeting Celeste DeLuca, the last and worst miscalculation of his life. Roman lowered his hands from Seraphina's face. He picked up his phone. He began to make the calls that would empty warehouses, pull men from streets, mobilize the full weight of 30 years of accumulated power and favors and fear, not the careful, calibrated response of a man managing a situation, but the absolute and total response of a man who has. Roman made 7 calls in 11 minutes. Seraphina stood at the office window and watched the canal below and listened to his voice behind her. Not the words. She couldn't track the words, but the register. The flat, controlled cadence of a man dismantling his own careful restraint 1 call at a time and replacing it with something that had no name she wanted to put to it. She heard him say numbers and locations. She heard him say a street name twice. She heard him say, once, very quietly, something in dialect that she'd grown up hearing Eduardo's men use and that she understood meant, "No one leaves." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Her mother had been in that study at 6 o'clock this morning. Seraphina had called her before leaving for the clinic. and they'd spoken for 4 minutes about nothing important. Something about the garden irrigation system. Something about a call Celeste needed to make to the family's attorney. 4 minutes of ordinary conversation between a mother and daughter who were still learning how to speak to each other honestly, still navigating the new geography of what they were becoming after 30 years of the old version. And now? She pushed off the glass and turned around. Roman was ending the 7th call. He looked at her immediately, the way he always looked at her in rooms, direct, reading her. And she saw in his face that the 40 minutes he'd promised her had compressed. Something he'd learned on one of the calls had changed the timeline. "How long?" she said. "We move in 20 minutes. He was already reaching for his jacket. "I have a location. Industrial district, northeast of the city. A steel processing facility that Russo has used as a secondary site for the past 2 years. He paused. "We have eyes on it. Your mother is inside." "Is she—" "She's alive. Flat and certain. Russo needs her alive. She has no value otherwise." The word value landed ugly. She absorbed it. "I'm coming with you," she said. "No." No pause, no deliberation, just no. "She's my mother." "Which is exactly why you're not coming." He crossed to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and removed something she recognized after a moment as a handgun in a shoulder holster, which he put on with the same unremarkable efficiency with which other men put on ties. "You are the only piece of this that Russo does not currently have. I intend to keep it that way." "Roman, if you're in that building and something goes wrong," he said, turning to face her, "then he has both of you, and I become a man who cannot think correctly." He held her gaze. His eyes were very steady, very dark. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. She hated it, and she understood it. "Then where do I go?" she said. "You stay here. This building has 4 of my people in it, and 2 in the street. Nobody gets to this floor who I haven't put here." He moved toward her and stopped close and looked at her face. "I need you to trust me." "I trust you," she said immediately. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but something. "I will bring her back," he said. She nodded. Her throat was tight. He touched her face once, the edge of his thumb against her cheekbone, the gesture that had become its own language between them. Then he walked to the door. "Roman." Her voice stopped him. He turned. She looked at him across the office. The jacket, the holster, the silver hair, the scar below his ear. And she thought about everything Eduardo had tried to tell her, and everything she'd spent years not wanting to understand, and all the weeks of this month that had rebuilt something inside her she hadn't known was broken. "Come back," she said. He looked at her for one moment. "Yes," he said, and left. The convoy was 4 cars, 12 men, and the specific silence of people who have done this before. Roman rode in the second car because the second car was the one nobody expected. He sat in the back seat with his phone and the information his people had assembled, and as the cars moved northeast through Milan's industrial periphery, through the neighborhoods where the city's working infrastructure lived, the warehouses and depots and processing facilities that made the polished center possible, he went through everything he knew about Damian Russo. 58 years old. Built his operation from a single neighborhood in the Eastern District 20 years ago, expanding outward through a combination of patience and brutality that Roman, who was not given to professional admiration, had always acknowledged as competent. Russo was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who made statements. He made positions. He moved into spaces and established himself so thoroughly that removing him became more expensive than tolerating him. He had wanted Roman's territory for 6 years. He had waited 4 months from the moment he learned Eduardo was dying to put his play in motion. That kind of patience was dangerous. It also meant Russo had thought through contingencies. He would have anticipated a response. He would have people positioned and exits prepared and a countermove assembled for the most likely version of tonight. Roman thought about what the most likely version of tonight looked like from Russo's position. A man coming to retrieve something he loved. Moving fast, maybe too fast. Arriving at the front of a building with force and noise. He told his driver to go to the service road on the eastern side of the facility. His phone buzzed. A text from the man he had watching the building. 6 outside. Unknown number inside. One room lit, ground floor, northwest corner. Northwest corner. He pulled up the facility's floor plan on his phone, sourced 2 hours ago from a building permit database that one of his people had access to, and looked at the northwest corner. A processing room. Large enough to hold people. One external window high on the wall obscured by equipment. He texted back, "Confirm single entry point to northwest room." The response came in 40 seconds. Corridor from east wing, single door, guarded. He thought for a moment. Then he made one more call to a man named Ferrero, who was not part of his regular operation, but who owed him a debt that had been sitting uncollected for 3 years, and he explained what he needed in approximately 90 seconds. Ferrero said he needed 15 minutes. "You have 10, Roman said, and ended the call. The cars stopped on the service road. The men got out. Roman got out and stood in the cold night air and looked at the facility. A large, low building, mostly dark, the single lit window in the northwest corner, a pale yellow rectangle against the black industrial sky. The smell was metal and chemicals, and somewhere beneath it, standing water. He looked at the 6 men visible outside, 2 at the main entrance, 2 at a secondary door on the south face, 2 more walking a perimeter that was regular enough to be predictable. He looked at his watch. 8 minutes. He signaled to his people and they moved into position with the quiet efficiency of men who had rehearsed this kind of thing. Not this specific night, but this specific geometry. The geometry of a building and a target, and the space between where you are and where you need to be. They spread into the shadows along the facility's eastern face without sound. Roman stood still. He was not afraid. He hadn't been afraid in a physical situation in a very long time. Not because he was incapable of it, but because fear in these moments was information he'd learned to process and set aside rather than feel. What he was, standing in the cold outside a building where Celeste DeLuca was being held by a man who had spent 4 months engineering this exact moment, was something closer to rage. The cold contained absolute variety that had nothing theatrical about it, and that he was very careful not to let move faster than his thinking. He thought about Seraphina in his office with her forehead against the glass. He thought about the 4 words on the phone screen. He thought about a man who had watched the DeLuca estate for 4 months, who had watched the greenhouse, who had taken the thing Seraphina DeLuca loved most. Her mother, her complicated, impossible, infuriating, grieving mother who had slapped him across the face and told him to end it, and been right about Farini and wrong about everything else, and who had, at a dinner table 3 days ago, said Eduardo used to do the same thing in a voice stripped of its armor, and had used her as a lever. His phone buzzed. Ferrero. Done. On the south face of the building, the lights went out. Both guards at the secondary door looked toward the sudden darkness. The 2 on perimeter turned. The 2 at the main entrance moved a step away from their post toward the dark side of the building. It was 4 seconds of divided attention. Roman was already moving. The eastern service door was unlocked. Ferrero's people had seen to that, along with the electrical disruption. Roman went through it first with 2 of his men immediately behind him, and the inside of the facility swallowed them in the specific darkness of large industrial spaces. The smell of old machinery and concrete and something acrid he couldn't immediately name, the sound of their own footsteps absorbed by the scale of the space. Emergency lighting had kicked on in parts of the building, red-tinged, low, casting long shadows from the dormant equipment. He moved through it using the floor plan in his memory. East wing toward the central corridor, the corridor toward the northwest room. He heard voices before he reached the corridor junction. 2 men, close, speaking quickly. He pressed against the wall and held up a fist, and the men behind him stopped. He listened. The voices were coming from the main corridor, not the guards he'd expected from the text, but more of them, 2 additional men repositioning from the south entrance toward the sound of the disruption. 4 men in the building then, plus whoever was in the room with Celeste. He waited 10 seconds after the voices passed, then moved. The corridor was 60 feet of concrete and emergency red. The door to the northwest room was at the far end, metal, industrial. A single guard standing in front of it with the alert posture of someone who has heard the commotion elsewhere and is trying to decide whether his assignment requires him to stay or investigate. Roman closed the 60 feet faster than the guard's decision-making. The man saw him at 20 feet and opened his mouth, and Roman was at 10 feet before the sound came out. The two men behind Roman handled it cleanly and quietly, and the guard was on the floor without having made enough noise to matter, and Roman took the key from his belt and stood in front of the door. He heard something on the other side. A voice. One voice, male, speaking Italian in the deliberate tone of someone making a point they want clearly understood. He tried the key. The lock turned. He opened the door. The room was large and smelled of industrial solvent and cold concrete. Bare bulbs overhead, several of them dead, the remainder giving a harsh flat light. Pipework along the walls. A chair in the center of the room. Celeste DeLuca was in the chair. Her wrists were bound behind her, a detail that produced in Roman a spike of anger so pure it almost moved his hands before his head could stop them. She was upright. Her hair was disheveled, and her left cheekbone showed the preliminary redness of a bruise that hadn't fully developed yet. But her eyes were open, and her posture, even bound to a chair, was Celeste DeLuca's posture, straight-spined, contained, communicating to the room that this was temporary. She looked at him. He looked at her. 3 meters to her right, Damien Russo stood with his hands clasped in front of him and an expression of complete unsurprise. He was a compact man, Russo, shorter than Roman, broader, with a face that was unremarkable in every detail, and that Roman had always thought was the most honest thing about him. He dressed conservatively. He looked like an accountant. He looked at Roman now with the expression of a man who had been waiting for a scheduled appointment. "You came faster than I expected," Russo said. "I had good information," Roman said. Russo tilted his head slightly. "The girl is still in your office, I assume?" Roman said nothing. "Smart," Russo said. "I thought perhaps... But no, you're not stupid." He looked at Celeste, then back at Roman. "She's unharmed. The cheek was... One of my men exceeded his instructions. I've spoken with him about it." "Where is he now?" Roman said. A slight pause. "Reassigned." Roman moved 2 steps into the room. His men stayed in the doorway. He could hear from elsewhere in the building the sounds of the rest of the operation playing out. Not close, not yet. "You went to a lot of trouble," Roman said. "Considerable trouble, yes." Russo didn't move. 4 months. "I think you appreciate the patience." "I appreciate the strategy," Roman said. "The execution is where it fell apart." Something shifted in Russo's expression. "Has it? You needed me here angry and moving fast. I am here. I am not moving fast." Roman looked at the man steadily. "You miscalculated the variable. The girl. Don't." Roman's voice went very flat on that single word, and something in the room changed. Temperature, atmospheric pressure, something, and even Russo went slightly still. A silence. "Roman," Celeste's voice came from the chair. Controlled, stripped down, all performance excised. "There are 2 men in the East Corridor. They'll be back in..." "I know," he said, without looking away from Russo. "My people have them." A muffled sound from elsewhere in the building confirmed it. Russo looked toward the door. Something moved through his expression, the first uncontrolled thing Roman had seen on his face, and then it was gone. "So," Russo said. "So," Roman said. "You understand that this does not resolve anything," Russo said. He had the particular composure of a man who had prepared for loss as thoroughly as he'd prepared for victory. "The operational gaps I've identified in your network, those remain. The people I've spoken with about your distraction, they remain. Tonight is a setback, not a conclusion." "You're right," Roman said. "It isn't a conclusion." He reached back without looking, and one of his men put something in his hand. A phone. Roman held it where Russo could see it. 3 weeks ago," Roman said, "you spoke with a man named Cataneo. You discussed the northeastern supply route and specific structural weaknesses in my operation that you believed I was not aware of. You were recorded." Russo looked at the phone. "2 weeks ago, you spoke with representatives of 2 other families about the same subject, also recorded." Roman held the phone steady. "Last week, you finalized the arrangement with Farini, the same arrangement that your people facilitated through Celeste's brother, the same arrangement that was undone before it finalized." He paused. "Everything. Documented." Russo's face had gone very still. "The people you spoke with," Roman said, Received copies of these recordings 4 hours ago. They are currently reassessing their positions with considerable urgency. A pause. You came here tonight to take something I love and use it to make me bleed publicly. Instead, you have made yourself visible to every family in the city at the same time that the documentation of your conversations with their people arrived in their hands. Roman tilted his head slightly. What do you think they are doing with that information right now? The silence in the room was complete. Celeste made a sound that might, in another context, have been the ghost of something like satisfaction. Russo looked at Roman, and for the first time since Roman had entered the room, he looked like what he actually was, a man who had overextended, whose architecture had been understood and turned, who was standing in the ruins of 4 months of work and beginning to calculate how bad the damage was. You didn't have those recordings 3 weeks ago, Russo said. No, Roman agreed. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know you existed as a problem. I've been somewhat occupied. He moved another step into the room. But I'm very good at moving quickly when I understand the shape of something. You know this. It's why you spent 4 months trying to ensure I wouldn't have time to. Russo looked at him. What do you want? Russo said. Tonight, I want you to untie her, Roman said, and I want you to walk out of this city. And tomorrow. Tomorrow you deal with the families whose confidence you've destroyed. That is not my problem. Roman looked at him. This is me being generous, Damien, because your plan was competent and your patience was real, and I have some respect for the quality of the work, even though the work was aimed at me. I am giving you an exit that doesn't end tonight in this building. Russo looked at him for a long time. Then he moved to the chair and untied Celeste's wrists. Celeste stood immediately. She did not rub her wrists or adjust her clothing or do any of the things that would have acknowledged that being tied to a chair had been anything other than a temporary inconvenience. She walked across the room to stand beside Roman, and she looked at Russo with an expression that contained 30 years of practiced imperviousness and said nothing at all. Roman looked at Russo. Russo looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "The girl." Roman said nothing. "She's the reason," Russo said, not accusatory. Almost curious. 4 months I watched that estate. I watched you. I have never in 20 years seen you show a vulnerability like that. Not once. He shook his head slightly. It seemed exploitable. I know, Roman said. You were right about what she is to me. You were wrong about what that means. He turned toward the door. Roman. Russo's voice. He stopped but didn't turn. The recordings. Russo's voice was flat. If they've already gone out, this is already finished regardless of tonight. Yes, Roman said. A silence. He walked out. Celeste said nothing for the first 10 minutes of the car ride. She sat in the back seat beside Roman and looked out the window at the city moving past, the industrial district giving way to the older residential zones, the lights thickening, the streets becoming recognizable as Milan rather than its working innards. And she held herself with the same rigid posture she'd maintained in the chair, as though relaxing it now would be admitting something she wasn't prepared to admit. Roman sat on his side of the back seat and let her have the silence. At the 11-minute mark, she said, How long did you know about Russo? Since this afternoon. You moved all of this in... She stopped. When I know what I'm dealing with, I move quickly, he said. She was quiet again. The recordings, she said. The families. We'll keep Russo occupied for the foreseeable future. Another silence. He planned this from before Eduardo died, she said. Yes. Which means someone had told him Eduardo was dying. Yes. She absorbed this. Her jaw was tight. The bruise on her cheekbone had deepened in the hour since he'd seen her. It was going to be significant by morning, and something in him tightened every time the car's interior light caught it at the right angle. Seraphina, Celeste said. In my office. Safe. You left her there. She's protected. 4 men in the building. Celeste turned to look at him for the first time since they'd left the facility. In the moving light from the street, she looked tired. Stripped down to something underneath the architecture, the way she'd looked for one moment at the dinner table 3 days ago when she'd said Eduardo used to do the same thing. But more so. The whole top layer of the construction worn away by an hour in a chair with her wrists bound by a man who'd wanted to use her as a lever. She wanted to come, Celeste said. I know. You stopped her. Yes. Her jaw worked. She looked back out the window. Good. It was not forgiveness. It was nowhere near forgiveness. But it was something. A single recognized correct decision, one point in a ledger that had many more points still outstanding. He understood it for what it was and did not push it further. Celeste. His voice was quiet. She didn't look at him. I'm sorry, he said, for how tonight happened. For all of it. The month, the position I put you in, the things I... He stopped. Not for what I feel, but for how it has cost you. She was very still. Eduardo told me once, she said, after a long moment, that you were the most honest man he'd ever worked with. I used to think that was absurd, given... She gestured slightly at the night outside, the implication being the entirety of the world they operated in. Given everything. But he meant it in a specific way. He meant that you never lied to him about what you were capable of. A pause. Most men in this world lie to themselves first and everyone else second. He said you didn't do that. Roman said nothing. I have been very angry with you, Celeste said. And some of that anger was legitimate, and some of it was grief. For my father. For the fact that I trusted you completely, and then the shape of things changed, and I didn't choose the change. She paused. I don't accept change well. Seraphina would tell you that's an understatement. I know, Roman said. She looked at him. She's told you about me, Celeste said. She's told me things you've done that she loves, and things you've done that have hurt her, in roughly equal measure. He held her gaze. She loves you in the way you love difficult things that are also essential. Something crossed Celeste's face. She looked away again. She's going to stay, Roman said. Not because I asked her to, because she wants to, and because you need her here, and she knows it even when you don't ask. He paused. I'm not asking you to be glad about any of this. I'm asking you to let her be where she wants to be without it costing her the relationship with you. Silence. The car turned onto the road that would take them back toward the center of the city and toward his office building. She showed me a photograph last week, Celeste said. Her voice was different again, quieter, scrubbed down. On her phone, you were at some cafe in Brera. You were laughing. A pause. I have never in 30 years seen you laugh. Roman was still. She looks at you the way Eduardo looked at this city, Celeste said. Like it's complicated and sometimes ugly, and she knows it, and she's going to stay anyway. He said nothing. She looked down at her hands in her lap. Her wrists were reddened where the binding had been. Take me to my daughter, she said. He leaned forward and told the driver to go directly to the office building, and the car accelerated through the Milan night, and Roman sat back and felt the adrenaline beginning its long recession from his blood, and felt underneath it the thing that had been there all evening driving everything. Not the strategy, not the 30 years, not the calculation, just the image of Seraphina at the window with her forehead against the glass, and the 4 words on a phone screen, and the understanding of what he was willing to burn for. They were 4 minutes from the office building when Roman's phone buzzed. Not his personal phone. The secondary one. The operational one that almost nobody had the number for. The one that had not buzzed with an unknown contact in 11 months. He looked at the screen. The number was Caruso's. But the text was not from Caruso. She left the building 20 minutes ago. She said she knew where the facility was. I tried to stop her. I'm sorry. The bottom fell out of the car. Roman was already dialing before the sentence had fully processed, already calling her number, already feeling the silence of a phone that rang once and went to voicemail with the particular sound of a device that has been turned off or is out of range. And in the front seat, his driver felt the change in the atmosphere and looked in the rearview mirror, and Roman said one word, drive, and gave him the address of a steel processing facility in the industrial northeast, and the car surged forward into the Milan night, and Roman sat with a dead phone in his hand and the full weight of everything he'd spent 4 months becoming to this woman, and the specific horror of understanding that she had done exactly what he would have done, move toward the thing she loved without waiting, without... She had taken a cab. That was the first thing Roman's people established when they arrived back at the facility. A cab, flagged from the street outside his office building, paid in cash from whatever she'd had in her coat pocket, directed to the industrial northeast using an address she had apparently memorized from the floor plan he'd pulled up on his phone and then left on his desk. She had memorized it, in the middle of everything. She had looked at that screen for 30 seconds while he was processing the text from Caruso, and she had locked the address into her head and said nothing. And then she had waited until his car was gone and his people's attention was distributed, and she had walked out of the building. Roman stood outside the facility in the cold and looked at the structure and felt something he almost never felt, which was the specific terror of not knowing. His men were already inside, the second sweep, the building that should have been empty, that he had left 40 minutes ago with Russo walking out the far side and Celeste beside him in the car. The building that was now lit differently than it had been, a light moving in the interior that hadn't been there before. His phone buzzed. One of his men inside. "She's here. Ground floor east wing. She's not alone." He was moving before the second sentence loaded. The eastern service door was still unlocked. He went through it fast, one man behind him, and the inside of the facility looked different with the emergency lighting off. Someone had restored main power to part of the building, and the overhead fluorescents in the east wing were running, harsh and white, casting the industrial space in the flat, unforgiving light of a place that was not meant to be seen clearly. He heard her voice before he turned the corner. Not frightened. Controlled and cold in the way he'd heard it once or twice in arguments, and recognized as the register she used when she was operating at the outermost edge of her composure. She was saying, "Put it down." He came around the corner and stopped. The east wing was a long corridor that opened at the far end into a secondary work floor. Equipment dormant, crates stacked against the walls, the smell of metal and industrial solvent sharp under the fluorescence. Seraphina was standing 12 feet from a man Roman recognized after a half-second as one of Russo's. Not one of the ones he'd accounted for, not one of the 6 outside or the 4 inside, but a 7th, held in reserve, the contingency that Roman had not factored because he hadn't known there was a 7th. The man was holding a phone. Not a weapon, a phone. He was trying to make a call, and Seraphina was standing between him and the exit with her weight slightly forward and her jaw locked. And the tableau had the particular quality of a situation that had been in motion for several minutes before Roman arrived. The man saw Roman and the phone dropped to his side. Seraphina turned. She looked at Roman across the work floor and he looked at her, and he saw several things in rapid succession. She was unharmed. She was shaking slightly in the way she'd been shaking in his office, and was again containing it through force of will, and she was furious. Not at him, or not only at him, but at the entire situation, at the building and the night and herself for the decision she'd made. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was flat. "I know," he said. He looked at the man with the phone. "Who are you calling?" The man said nothing. "Russo has left the city," Roman said. "Whoever you were calling, they are not going to help you, and the men who were in this building earlier are currently being managed by my people." He held the man's gaze. "Put the phone down and walk out the south door. Don't stop." The man put the phone down and walked. When his footsteps had faded into the building's ambient sounds, Roman looked back at Seraphina. She was still standing in the same spot. The fluorescents were very bright, and the shadows they cast were very hard, and she looked exhausted. Not just tonight exhausted. Deeper than that, the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for weeks, and has finally, in the last hour, been forced to feel the full weight of it. He crossed the work floor and stopped 2 feet from her. He did something he almost never did in operational spaces, in buildings where the situation was not yet fully resolved, in rooms where unknown variables remained. He reached out and pulled her into him with both arms and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest and her hands came up and gripped the front of his jacket, and she made one sound, one compressed and involuntary. And then she was still. He held her. The fluorescence hummed. "I couldn't stay in the office," she said into his chest. Her voice was muffled and entirely without its usual architecture. "I tried. For 20 minutes I tried. I know. I knew where it was. You left the screen. I know." I needed to... She stopped. She's my mother. I know. He pressed his hand against the back of her head. She's in my car. She's safe. She's been safe for 40 minutes. She went very still. She's safe. Unharmed except for a bruise on her cheekbone. In my car, which has been driving in circles around the block for the last 12 minutes because I told my driver not to bring her here until I had eyes on you. Seraphina pulled back slightly and looked up at his face. Her eyes were wet. She didn't seem to notice. She's in the car, Seraphina said. Yes. She's been in the car this whole time. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, and then something moved through her face, the desperate edge of it, the adrenaline architecture. And it cracked, and she pressed her face back against his chest, and he felt her exhale, a long, shaking exhale that ran through her whole body, and he held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the holding wasn't already saying. After a while, she pulled back again. She looked at his face. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the angle of his jaw. A gesture he hadn't seen from her before, something new, something that she seemed to do without knowing she was doing it. I'm sorry I left the building, she said. You don't have to. I do. Her voice was direct. You told me to stay. You told me why. And I left anyway because I couldn't manage. Because the fear was bigger than the logic. She held his gaze. I need you to know that I know it was the wrong call. He looked at her. It was the wrong call, he said. You are also the only person in 30 years who has walked into one of my operations unarmed and without backup because they love someone. He paused. I don't know what to do with that. She looked at him. Neither do I, she said. But I'm not sorry about that part. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached up and covered her hand where it was still resting against his jaw and pressed it briefly and released it. Let's go get your mother, he said. Celeste was standing outside the car. Not sitting inside it, waiting. Standing outside in the cold industrial street with her arms crossed and her eyes on the facility entrance. And when the doors opened and Seraphina came out, something happened to Celeste DeLuca's face that Roman had never seen happen to it before, and that he looked away from immediately, because it was not for him. Seraphina crossed the space between them in 4 steps. They did not speak. Seraphina put her arms around her mother, and Celeste held her daughter with the compressed force of a woman who had spent an hour in a chair thinking about all the conversations she hadn't finished, and all the ones she'd refused to start. And Roman stood by the car and looked at the black industrial sky and gave them the only thing he could, which was the privacy of not being watched. After a while, Celeste said something quietly. He couldn't hear what it was. After another while, Seraphina said something back. Then Celeste looked up, over her daughter's shoulder, and found Roman where he was standing. She looked at him for a moment. This man she had slapped and trusted and raged at and watched untie her wrists and deliver her to her daughter. And she made a very small gesture with her head. Not forgiveness, not yet. Too much history, too much grief, too much rearrangement of 30 years. But an acknowledgement. A single reluctant data point entered into the ledger. He nodded. They got in the car and drove back toward the center of the city. The days after were not easy. Easy was not a thing that happened in the aftermath of the kind of night that facility represented. What happened was slower and more complicated than easy. It was the particular process of people who have been through something together and must now figure out what that means for the architecture of their ongoing lives. The bruise on Celeste's cheekbone lasted 9 days, and during those 9 days, Seraphina moved between her mother's room and her own with a frequency and a gentleness that Roman observed from a careful distance, and that told him more about what the two of them were building between them than any dinner conversation could have. He gave them space. He came to the estate when there was a reason to be there, and he did not manufacture reasons. He called Seraphina in the evenings, and they talked, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes, always with the particular quality of two people who are figuring out the real shape of something rather than the version they'd imagined. On the 3rd day, she said, "My mother asked about you this morning." He was quiet for a moment. What did she ask? She asked if you were going to keep the Northeastern Territory. After Russo. A pause. I told her I didn't know. She said she thought you might use this as an opportunity to reduce, pull back from some of it. Did she say that with approval or with suspicion? A brief silence that might have been the ghost of a smile on her end. Both. It's my mother. She does nothing with only one feeling at a time. He thought about the Northeastern Territory. He thought about the calls he'd been making for a week, the careful disaggregation he'd begun. Not dramatic, not announced, just the quiet rerouting of things that had been his for years into arrangements where they were someone else's problem. He'd started it before the facility. He'd started it, if he was honest, somewhere around the night of the greenhouse, when he'd stood in the warm, humid air among the white orchids and felt the future rearranging itself around a set of priorities that he hadn't had the previous week. She's right, he said. Another pause. Roman. It was always going to happen eventually, he said. I'm 52 years old. The men who don't know when to reduce end up in facilities like the one we were in last week, except on the chair. He paused. I've known for a while that the shape of things needed to change. I was waiting for a reason that felt sufficient. And now you have one, she said. Now I have several. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing, slow and even, the way it went when she was processing something rather than reacting to it. I need to go back to New York, she said. My residency. I deferred it, and I can't defer it again indefinitely. I know. I need to finish becoming the thing I went to New York to become. A pause. It doesn't change what this is. But I need you to understand that I can't stay in Milan indefinitely. I can't let this... She stopped. I can't let loving you become the reason I don't finish building my own life. He sat with that for a moment. The full weight of it. The complete honesty of it, which was both exactly what he'd asked for and harder to receive than he'd anticipated. How long is the residency? He said. 3 years. But I'm 1 year in. A pause. 2 more years. Milan to New York is 11 hours, he said. She was quiet. I have an office in New York, he said. Have had one for 15 years. I've been managing it remotely for 3 of those years because there was nothing in New York that required me to be there. A pause. That calculation changes. Another silence. Then quietly, you would do that. I would do considerably more than that, he said. 2 years is not very long. She didn't say anything for a moment. He heard her exhale. I'll tell my mother, she said. How do you think she'll take it? Badly, she said. And then eventually, not badly. A pause. She's learning. We both are. He thought about what Celeste had said in the car. She looks at you the way Eduardo looked at this city. And he thought about Eduardo on the phone 3 months before he died. And he thought about how the things that matter most have a way of making the path to them look, in retrospect, inevitable, even when every step of it was chosen and some of the choices nearly cost everything. Seraphina, he said. Yes. I need to tell you something. Tell me. When I was standing outside that facility tonight, before I went in, before I knew where you were, he stopped, pressed his hand against the back of his own neck. He was not practiced at this, at the verbal presentation of interior states, and he was aware of it. I have been in situations over 30 years that required me to function correctly under conditions that were extreme, and I have always been able to do that. The calculation runs. The emotion is information, and then it is set aside and the calculation runs. And tonight, she said, tonight when I read that text and understood that you had gone to that building, the calculation did not run. He said it plainly. There was no strategy and no contingency and no managed response. There was just you and the building and 4 minutes between them, and I have never in my adult life been as reduced as I was in those 4 minutes. The silence on her end had a different quality now. Reduced, she repeated softly. It is not a comfortable thing to admit, he said. No, she said. I imagine not. I am telling you because you asked for real, he said. And because you deserve to know that whatever you are to me, it is not something that coexists comfortably with the way I have operated for 30 years. It is not a thing I can compartmentalize or manage. A pause. I am not entirely certain what to do with that. She was quiet for a long moment. Roman, she said. Yes, that's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. Possibly the most honest thing I've ever said to anyone. Another pause. Good, she said. And the word contained something layered, relief and recognition, and the particular satisfaction of a person who asked for something real and received it without performance. "I think that's good." "I hope it is," he said. "It is," she said. "I promise you, it is." 1. 2 weeks later, Celeste asked Roman to come to the estate for coffee. Not dinner, not a meeting, not a business matter. Coffee, mid-morning, the smaller sitting room, just the two of them. He came because she asked, and because the asking itself was something he understood. She poured the coffee herself, which was a choice. The staff was there. It would have been simpler, but she poured it herself and set it in front of him and sat across from him with her own cup and looked at him with the expression he'd come to associate with Celeste at her most genuine, which was the expression she wore when she had decided that what she was about to say cost something and had decided to pay it anyway. "I owe you an apology," she said. He said nothing. "Not for slapping you," she added. "I stand by that." "Fair," he said, "for the things I said to Seraphina in those first days, the way I managed this, as though it were a situation to be resolved rather than—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "She told me what you said, in the car on the way back, about how she loves me." She looked at the cup in her hands. "She didn't tell me to make me feel guilty. She told me because she wanted me to know that you see her clearly, that you tell her the truth about things even when the truth is about me. She would tell you herself if you gave her the opening," Roman said. "I know." Celeste looked at him. "I'm not good at openings. Eduardo was always better at those." A pause. "He left a letter, for me, written 3 months before he died." She looked at the window. He said that the things he was proudest of in his life were the things he had let in rather than managed, and that he hoped I would learn the difference before it cost me too much. She was quiet for a moment. "He wrote it before he knew about you and Seraphina. He couldn't have known." She looked back at Roman. "But it read like he did." Roman thought about Eduardo's voice on the phone. "Look after my granddaughter." The specific gravity of it, the way it had the quality of someone naming the thing that mattered most before they ran out of time to name it. "He knew something," Roman said. "He may not have known the specifics. But Eduardo knew people better than people knew themselves. It was his greatest skill." Celeste considered this. "He liked you more than he ever liked me," she said. It was said without bitterness. An observation, a fact, offered plainly. "He loved you more than he liked you sometimes," Roman said, which is its own kind of respect. She looked at him. Then, completely unexpectedly, Celeste DeLuca made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Short, quiet, reluctant, scraped out of somewhere that didn't often see light, and looked away. "She said the same thing to me last night," she said. "Different words, same thing." "She's his granddaughter," Roman said. Celeste was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, and then she looked back at him, and there was something in her face that was not the Celeste who managed and contained and constructed, but something underneath it, a woman who was 53 and had lost her father and was sitting in his house trying to figure out how to continue without the person who had always been the fixed point. "Don't hurt her," Celeste said. It was not a threat. It had no architecture of warning in it. It was just a request. From a mother to a man who was in the difficult and irrevocable position of being loved by her daughter. "I will try very hard not to," Roman said. "And when I fail at that, because I will fail at that, imperfectly, unintentionally, the way people fail the things they love, I will tell her the truth about it, and I will try to do better." Celeste held his gaze. "Eduardo told me once that the only men worth trusting were the ones who knew they were capable of failure," she said. "He told me the same thing," Roman said, "many times." Something settled between them in the sitting room, not the warmth of people who have forgiven everything or arrived at ease. Something more accurate than that. The particular equilibrium of two people who have been through enough together that performance is no longer available to either of them, and who must therefore occupy the same space as whatever they actually are to each other. Celeste picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat in Eduardo's house in the morning light and drank coffee and did not pretend it was simple and did not make it harder than it was. And outside the garden moved in the autumn wind and the city continued its business, and the world did what it always did, which was go on. Seraphina left for New York on a Thursday in November. The morning was gray and cool, the kind of morning that makes Milan look like a painting of itself. All soft light and stone, the colors muted and beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they are slightly blurred. She stood in the driveway of the estate with one bag. She had sent the rest ahead, 3 boxes of things accumulated over 4 months that now had to coexist with the apartment and the life she was returning to. The boxes had felt strange to pack, a small physical evidence of the fact that 2 versions of her life now had to find a way to share space. Her mother stood on the front steps. They had said the real things the previous evening, awkwardly, imperfectly, with long pauses and several moments where one or both of them reached for the old language and had to put it down and find different words. It had been one of the harder conversations of Seraphina's life, and also one of the most necessary. They had not resolved everything. You did not resolve 30 years of a certain kind of mother and daughter in one evening. But they had named things. They had said things that had needed saying since Seraphina was 17 and leaving for the first time, and the naming of things she had learned in 4 months that had rearranged her understanding of almost everything was where repair began. Celeste came down the steps and stood in front of her. She reached out and straightened the collar of Seraphina's coat. A small, precise gesture, her mother's hands, always certain, the gesture so familiar from childhood that it landed somewhere behind Seraphina's sternum. "Call me when you land," Celeste said. "I will. And when your first shift ends, Mama, humor me." Seraphina looked at her mother's face. The bruise was completely gone now. She was back to the constructed version, the architecture restored, but underneath it, Seraphina could see the other one, the woman who had said I was frightened and meant it, who had drunk coffee with Roman Valenti in the sitting room and emerged from it looking, if not repaired, then at least less fractured than before. "I'll call," Seraphina said. Her mother pulled her in briefly, firmly, the hug of someone who doesn't do this easily and does it completely when they do. Then she released her and stepped back, and that was that, because Celeste DeLuca did not prolong goodbyes. Roman was leaning against the second car. She crossed the driveway to him. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, that complete, steady attention that she had initially mistaken for surveillance and had come to understand was simply how he was with things that mattered to him. He was not dressed for the airport. He would not be going to the airport. He had offered, and she had asked him not to, because she knew herself well enough to know that if he stood at an airport gate, she would have difficulty getting on the plane. 2 years, she said, give or take. You're going to come to New York, regularly, and I'll come back here for as often as you can, he said, and when you can't, you call. And when the call isn't enough, I get on a plane. He said it simply, the way he said things that were already decided. 2 years is not very long. She looked at his face, the silver hair, the scar, the eyes that she had spent months learning to read and would spend years still learning. You said that before, she said. It remains true. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the gesture she'd discovered in the facility that she still didn't entirely understand the origin of, the one that felt like taking inventory of the fact of him. And he turned his face slightly into it. Roman. His name in her mouth, the way it always was, like stepping toward something, like choosing. Yes, I'm not the same person who came home to that funeral, she said. I don't know exactly who I am yet, but I'm not her. I know. And she looked at him. You're not done changing either. The Northeastern Territory, the things you've been doing these past weeks, that's not finished. No, he agreed. It isn't. That's going to be hard, she said, pulling back from what you've been for 30 years. People don't do that cleanly. I know. He held her gaze. I'm not looking for clean. I'm looking for different. She studied his face for a long moment. Then she said the things she'd been holding since the night in the facility, since the moment she'd walked through that service door and turned and seen him across the work floor and understood, with the complete certainty that some things arrive in, that the distance between what she'd told herself about her life and what her life actually was had collapsed to nothing. I love you, she said, plainly, without theater. I needed you to know that I know it. Not as a variable and not as a crisis. Just, I love you. He looked at her, His jaw moved slightly. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him moving through the thing that was difficult for him. The full reception of something, without managing it, without converting it immediately into action or strategy. Just letting it land. "I know," he said. And then, "I love you. More than I have language for. More than 30 years of building things prepared me for." He paused. "And that is the most frightening and the most correct thing I have ever known." She looked at him. She pressed up briefly and kissed him. Not long, not elaborate, just the clean fact of it, and stepped back. 11 hours, she said. 11 hours, he agreed. She got in the car. The car moved down the driveway and through the estate gates and into the Milan morning, and Seraphina looked back once through the rear window. Roman was still where he'd been standing. He did not wave. He just watched the car the way he watched things, completely, steadily, with the full weight of his attention, until the gate closed between them. She turned back and looked at the road ahead. Later, months later, in the specific quiet of a New York apartment at 2 a.m. after a long shift, with Milan's 7 time zones behind her, and a phone in her hand and a man's voice in her ear telling her about the Northeastern Territory, and the Cafe and Brera, and the slow, difficult, imperfect work of becoming something different from what you've been. Seraphina would try to locate the moment it had become inevitable. The balcony in the rain, the greenhouse, the dining table, the facility floor, the driveway in the November morning. She could never find a single moment. It was all of them. It was the accumulation. It was the way consequence and choice are always wound around each other so tightly, you can never fully separate what you decided from what decided you. Her grandfather had known something about that. She thought about his letter, which her mother had finally read aloud to her one evening in October. Not all of it, the private part stayed private, but certain lines that Celeste had decided, in her deliberate way, were meant for both of them. The things I was proudest of were the things I had let in rather than managed. Eduardo Moretti, who had built things and lost things and spent 30 years keeping a balance that his death had finally disturbed, had understood that the balance was never the point. The point was what you let matter. The point was what you moved toward and what you stayed for and what you became in the staying. Seraphina was 24 years old. She was a first-year resident in a hospital in New York. She was the granddaughter of a man who had been many things to many people, and to her had been the first person who asked what she wanted without immediately explaining why she couldn't have it. She was in love with the complicated, difficult, changing man who was 7 time zones away and who had told her, plainly and without performance, that loving her was the most frightening and most correct thing he had ever known. She was her mother's daughter in more ways than she'd wanted to admit, and in more ways than she'd feared, and that was something she was learning to hold without the old resistance. Learning to find in the inheritance not just the difficulty, but the strength that had kept Celeste DeLuca standing straight in a chair with her wrists bound by men who had underestimated her, the way they always underestimated DeLuca women, the way they would keep underestimating them. She thought about a villa that had spent a month echoing with crisis and cold wars and grief, and that was now, slowly, imperfectly, in the way all true things arrive, becoming something else. She thought about November light in a stone driveway. She thought about a man watching a car until a gate closed between them, and the particular faith of that watching. Not the faith of certainty, but the other kind, the harder kind, the kind that knows the distance and stays anyway. She put the phone to her ear. He answered on the second ring. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not." A pause. And in it the 11 hours and the 7 time zones and everything they contained, the grief and the greenhouses and the rain and the orchids and the facility floor and the driveway and the slow, unfinished, ongoing work of 2 people building something real in the space between who they had been and who they were becoming. "Tell me about the cafe," she said. And across the ocean, in a city learning to be different from the city it had been, Roman Valenti sat at a window above a canal and told her about the cafe in the amber light, and the city outside moved through its night, and the story of them continued. Not cleanly, not easily, not without cost, but truly and completely and without end.